The world was not yet awake, and the darkness that filled the small attic room was heavy, physical, and textured like thick velvet. It was the hour before the dawn, the deepest trough of the night where the silence of the great house was absolute, save for the rhythmic, low breathing of the winter wind against the slate roof tiles overhead. The room was cold. It was a stillness of temperature that went beyond mere chill. It was a settled, ancient cold that had seeped into the very grain of the wooden floorboards, into the plaster of the sloping walls, and into the iron frame of the narrow bed. There was no light, only the varying densities of shadow, sketched out in deep charcoal tones and midnight blues against the black. The air was still, hanging suspended in the room, holding its breath. To breathe in this room was to taste the frost. With every exhalation, a faint, ghostly plume of mist would form in the darkness, a small cloud of warmth that rose and immediately vanished, consumed by the overwhelming frigidity of the space. The scullery maid lay beneath the heavy, rough wool of the blanket, her body curled tight to preserve the small pocket of heat she had generated during the few hours of sleep. The wool was scratchy, coarse against her chin, smelling of raw sheep and lye soap, a smell that was comforting in its familiarity and its density. It was a heavy covering, a barrier against the pressing weight of the winter air that filled the room. Outside, far beyond the thick panes of the small dormer window, the world was locked in ice. The window itself was a landscape of frozen intricate patterns. Frost had bloomed across the glass during the night, growing in silence, forming ferns and feathers, crystalline forests and jagged mountain ranges of white ice that obscured the view of the dark sky. If there was moonlight, it was diffused through this thick layer of frost, entering the room not as a beam, but as a faint, pale luminescence, a weak gray glow that barely illuminated the washstand in the corner. The frost was thick, opaque, a curtain of ice drawn between the sleeper and the world. It muffled the sound of the wind, turning the gusting air into a distant, soft murmur, like the sound of the sea heard from miles away. The maid opened her eyes. There was no sudden movement, no startle of waking. It was a slow transition from the heavy, dark sleep of exhaustion to the heavy, dark reality of the morning. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, tracing the familiar sloping line of the ceiling where the rafters met the wall. The timber was old, darkened by time and smoke, absorbing what little light existed. She lay there for a long moment, listening. The house was silent. The family below, in the great warm rooms with their heavy curtains and dying fires, were deep in slumber. The upper servants, the housekeeper and the butler, were still drifting in their warmer beds. Only the scullery, the lowest heart of the house, demanded attention this early. Only the fires that had turned to gray ash needed to be cleared. Only the water, frozen in the pipes and the buckets, needed to be broken. She pushed the wool blanket down. The cold air rushed in instantly, claiming the space, touching her skin with fingers of ice. It was a shock, but a familiar one, a daily ritual of endurance. The air smelled of cold dust and old wood. She sat up, the mattress of straw shifting with a dry, rustling sound that seemed loud in the quiet room. Her feet found the floorboards. The wood was bare, unpolished, and freezing. The cold traveled up through the soles of her feet, a sharp, biting sensation that made the blood retreat. She stood in the darkness, a silhouette against the faint gray of the frosted window, her breath clouding around her face like a veil. There was no candle to be lit here, no waste of wax for the attic. She knew the shape of the room by heart, knew exactly where the washstand stood, where the chair with her clothes was positioned. She moved slowly, her movements economical and practiced, designed to disturb the air as little as possible. She reached for the basin on the stand. The water inside had frozen solid. Her fingers brushed against the surface of the ice, feeling the smooth, hard perfection of it. It was a solid block, trapped within the ceramic bowl. There would be no washing of the face this morning, not until the fires were lit below. She withdrew her hand, her fingertips numb and tingling from the brief contact. Her clothes were piled on the rush-bottomed chair. They were cold, stiff with the temperature of the room. She picked up the stockings first. They were thick, knitted from gray wool, heavy and shapeless. As she pulled them on, the wool felt like ice against her skin, but slowly, as she smoothed them up her legs, the friction generated a faint, dull warmth. She fastened them, her fingers fumbling slightly with the cold, the movements slow and deliberate. Everything in this world was slow. The cold slowed the blood, slowed the mind, slowed the very passage of time. The act of dressing was a long, silent ceremony. Next came the petticoats, layers of heavy linen and flannel. They were cumbersome, weighing down her frame. She tied the strings around her waist, the fabric bunching and gathering. Then the dress. It was a dark, slate-gray wool, rough to the touch, worn smooth at the elbows and the hem. It smelled of the scullery, of coal dust, damp stone, and onions. It was a garment of service, designed for durability, not comfort. She pulled it over her head, her arms fighting through the heavy sleeves, emerging into the cold air again. She buttoned the bodice, the small bone buttons cold and hard under her thumbs. One by one she fastened them, counting them in the silence of her mind. 1, 2, 3, 4, up to the high collar that scratched against her neck. She sat on the edge of the bed to put on her boots. They were leather, old and cracked, stiffened by the damp and the frost. She had to work her feet into them, pushing against the resistance of the cold leather. The laces were rough twine, fraying at the ends. She pulled them tight, feeling the pressure around her ankles. The boots were heavy, weighted with iron hobnails on the soles. When she stood, they clunked softly on the wood, a dull, thudding sound that did not echo in the small room but seemed to be absorbed by the shadows. She tied her apron last, an expanse of coarse white canvas that covered the front of the gray dress, a shield against the grime of the day to come. She was ready. She paused for a moment, listening again to the wind. It was picking up, a low moan in the chimney flue, a sound of loneliness and vast distances. The window pane rattled slightly in its frame, a tiny, shivering sound. The frost on the glass seemed to glow with a faint, spectral blue light, the only color in the monochrome world of the attic. She wrapped a heavy woolen shawl around her shoulders, crossing it over her chest and tying it behind her back, adding one more layer against the chill that awaited her outside. She opened the door of her room. The latch clicked, a sharp metallic sound. The corridor beyond was a tunnel of darkness. The air here was stale, smelling of old carpet and beeswax, but it was just as cold as the room. She walked softly, despite the heavy boots, placing her feet carefully near the edges of the floorboards to avoid the creaks. She passed the closed doors of the other servants, silent sentinels in the gloom. The house felt immense around her, a sleeping beast of stone and timber. She could feel the weight of the roof above, the thickness of the walls, the sheer mass of the structure pressing down. She reached the top of the back stairs. These were narrow, steep, and uncarpeted, made of plain oak worn down in the center of each tread by generations of feet. There was no handrail, only the rough plaster of the wall to guide her hand. She descended into the dark. Down, down. The air grew slightly damper as she went lower, leaving the dry cold of the attic for the humid, stone cold of the lower levels. The darkness was absolute here. She moved by memory and touch, her hand trailing along the wall, feeling the bumps and cracks in the plaster, the grain of the wood. At the bottom of the stairs, she pushed through the green baize door that separated the servants' quarters from the working areas of the house. The door swung silently on well-oiled hinges, breathing a draft of air that smelled of cold iron and soot. She was in the back passage now. The floor beneath her boots changed from wood to flagstone. The stone was uneven, cold enough to be felt through the thick leather of her soles. It was a deep, penetrating cold that rose up from the earth itself. To her left was the kitchen. She entered the vast, high-ceilinged room. It was a cavern of shadows. The great iron range, which would roar with heat later in the day, was a dark, slumbering monster against the far wall. It was cold to the touch, black and silent. The copper pots and pans hanging from the racks above caught the faintest glimmer of light from somewhere, perhaps a gap in the shutters, and glowed with a dull, reddish-brown hue like dying embers. But there was no heat. The large wooden tables were scrubbed white, standing like islands in the sea of gray stone floor. The room smelled of cold fat, stale bread, and the metallic tang of the copper. She did not stop here. Her domain was lower, further, colder. She walked through the kitchen, her footsteps echoing slightly now on the stone, a rhythmic clack, clack, clack that measured out the seconds. She passed the pantry, smelling the sharp scent of cheese and apples kept in the dark. She passed the larder, where the meats hung in the cold air, silent shapes wrapped in muslin. She reached the door to the scullery. The scullery was a smaller room built of bare brick and stone, jutting out from the main body of the house. It was here that the hardest work was done. It was here that the water entered the house. The room was freezing. The temperature was barely different from the outside air. The stone sinks were lined along the wall, deep troughs of yellow sandstone. The brass taps were dull and tarnished. In the corner, a pile of coal waited, black and glittering in the gloom. On a shelf near the door, a box of lucifer matches and a tin lantern sat waiting. She reached for them. Her hands were stiff, the fingers moving slowly. She opened the lantern, the glass screeching softly against the metal frame. She took a match, struck it against the rough brick of the wall. A flare of yellow light, blinding in the darkness, followed by the sharp, stinging smell of sulfur. She held the flame to the wick of the candle inside the lantern. The wick caught, a small blue flame growing into a steady, tear-shaped yellow light. She lowered the glass. The light transformed the room. It pushed the shadows back into the corners, creating a sphere of warm, golden illumination. It revealed the texture of the brick walls, the rough pitting of the stone floor, the grain of the wooden draining board. It cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and warped as she moved. The light was soft, hazy, like a drawing in pastel, softening the harsh edges of the iron and stone. It did not provide warmth, but it provided a focal point, a small anchor in the vast, cold sea of the morning. She set the lantern on the wooden bench. Beside it stood the buckets. They were large, made of heavy galvanized iron with thick wire handles. They were empty now, waiting. This was her first task. The house needed water. The kitchen needed water for the kettle, for the porridge, for the tea. The scullery needed water for the scrubbing, and the pipes were frozen. The taps would yield nothing but a hollow gurgle. She had to go to the river. She picked up 2 of the buckets. The handles were freezing, biting into her palms even through the calluses. The metal clanged softly against her leg as she lifted them. They were heavy, even when empty, built to endure, not to be carried with ease. She adjusted her grip, feeling the weight settle in her shoulders, a familiar burden. The wool of her sleeves bunched under the strain. She walked to the back door. It was a heavy door made of thick oak planks reinforced with iron straps. A large iron bolt secured it. She set the buckets down with a clatter. She gripped the cold iron of the bolt with both hands. It was stiff, frozen in its housing. She pushed, leaning her weight against it. The metal groaned, a harsh, grinding sound of iron against iron. She pushed harder, her breath coming in short, white puffs in the lantern light. With a sudden clunk, the bolt slid back. She lifted the latch and pulled. The door stuck for a moment, the seal of ice around the frame holding it fast, then gave way with a tearing sound of frost breaking. The door swung inward. The wind entered instantly. It was not a draft. It was a physical force, a wall of moving air that carried the profound, absolute cold of the winter landscape. It swirled around her, billowing her skirts, blowing the loose strands of hair across her face. It smelled of snow, of frozen earth, of pine needles and vast, empty spaces. It extinguished the small pocket of still air in the scullery, replacing it with the wild, restless atmosphere of the outside. The lantern flame flickered violently, casting erratic, jumping shadows on the walls, but it held. She picked up the buckets again. She stepped over the threshold. The ground beneath her boots was hard as iron. The cobblestones of the yard were coated in a thin, treacherous layer of verglas, clear, hard ice that glazed the stone. She walked carefully, her boots finding purchase on the grit between the stones. The world outside was a study in gray and blue. The sky was still dark, a deep, heavy indigo, but to the east, a faint, bruising line of slate gray suggested the coming dawn. The trees in the orchard were black skeletons, their branches etched against the sky in fine charcoal lines. The garden walls were masses of shadow. The wind was louder here. It rushed through the branches of the elms, creating a sound like rushing water. It tugged at her shawl, tried to pull the buckets from her hands. It was a cold that burned. It stung her cheeks, her nose, her ears. It found the gaps in her clothing, the space between her collar and her scarf, the space between her sleeve and her glove. It was relentless. She walked across the yard, the lantern swinging in her hand, casting a moving pool of yellow light on the frozen ground. The light illuminated the frost, millions of tiny ice crystals glittering like diamonds on the cobblestones, on the dead vines clinging to the wall, on the rim of the old rain barrel. The world was suspended in crystal. She reached the gate that led to the path. The wood of the gate was furred with white hoarfrost, soft and powdery to the touch. She pushed it open with her shoulder, keeping her hands on the buckets. The hinges whined in the cold. She stepped through onto the dirt path that led down the hill. The path was rutted, the mud frozen into jagged peaks and valleys that threatened to twist an ankle with every step. The grass on either side was stiff, coated in white, crunching softly under the hem of her long skirt as it brushed against the stalks. The sound of her walking was the only human noise in the landscape. The crunch, crunch, crunch of heavy boots on frozen earth, accompanied by the rhythmic squeak, squeak of the lantern handle and the low moan of the wind. She was heading towards the river. It lay at the bottom of the valley, a dark vein winding through the white landscape. She could not see it yet, but she could smell it, a smell of damp weeds, of wet stone, of deep, cold mud. The descent was slow. She had to balance the weight of the buckets, watching the pool of light from her lantern to avoid the patches of ice. Her breath streamed behind her, a long ribbon of white mist in the wind. The cold was seeping through her boots now. Her toes curled inside the leather, seeking warmth that wasn't there. Her fingers, wrapped around the wire handles, were locking into claws, the cold making the joints stiff and unresponsive. She did not complain, even in her thoughts. This was the way of things. The winter was a fact, like the stone of the house or the weight of the buckets. It was simply there to be endured. As she descended the slope, the trees grew thicker. Ancient willows and oaks, their trunks gnarled and twisted, loomed out of the darkness. The lantern light caught the texture of their bark, deep fissures and ridges, moss frozen into hard green patches. The shadows of the branches reached out across the path, grasping at her feet like dark fingers. The wind made the branches clash together, a sound like dry bones rattling. She could see the river now. It was a broad, flat expanse of gray-white. The water had surrendered to the cold days ago. The ice stretched from bank to bank, a solid sheet that reflected the faint light of the sky with a dull, matte sheen. Along the edges, where the reeds poked through, the ice was rough and white, but in the center it looked dark, clear, and dangerously smooth. She reached the bank. The ground here was flat, covered in frozen mud and stones. A small wooden jetty protruded a few feet over the ice, its pilings coated in thick collars of frozen spray. She walked onto the wood, the boards creaking loudly in the silence. She set the buckets down on the end of the jetty. The metal rang against the frozen wood, a sharp, clear sound that echoed across the ice. She stood for a moment, looking out at the frozen river. It was a desolate, beautiful sight. The silence was immense. The wind seemed to die down here in the valley, leaving a stillness that was amplified by the vast expanse of ice. The air was colder here, radiating up from the frozen surface. It was a damp, piercing cold that settled into the lungs. She turned to the small wooden post at the end of the jetty. Hanging there, suspended by a leather thong, was the ice breaker. It was a heavy tool, a long shaft of ash wood tipped with a solid iron chisel point. The wood of the handle was polished smooth by years of use, dark with oil and the sweat of many hands. The iron tip was rusted and pitted, but sharp. She took the tool in her hands. The wood was freezing, sucking the heat from her palms. She weighed it, feeling the balance. It was heavy, top-heavy with the iron. She stepped to the edge of the jetty. Below her, the ice waited. It was thick, a barrier between her and the water she needed. She could see bubbles trapped deep within the ice, suspended in time, white spheres in the dark glass. She raised the iron bar. She did not strike yet. She held it high, her silhouette dark against the gray sky, a lone figure in a frozen world. She took a breath, the cold air filling her chest, sharp and clean. She prepared for the labor, the breaking of the ice, the daily battle against the winter. The lantern on the jetty flickered, the flame dancing behind the glass, casting a warm, trembling light on the toe of her boot and the hem of her gray dress. The shadows stretched long behind her, reaching back up the path towards the house, towards the scullery, towards the duty that waited. But for this moment there was only the maid, the river, and the ice. She tightened her grip on the ash wood handle. The cold bit into her knuckles. She looked down at the dark surface, searching for the spot she had broken yesterday, which had already frozen over again during the night. A scar of white on the gray. That was the weak point. That was where she would strike. The iron tip descended. It did not fall with a rush of speed, but with a heavy, deliberate gravity, guided by the muscles of her shoulders and the stiff grip of her hands. It carved a silent arc through the freezing air, a dark blur against the gray backdrop of the river valley. The movement was slow, weighted by the density of the metal and the thickness of the wool layers she wore. When the iron point struck the ice, the sound was not a crash, but a sharp, resonant crack that seemed to split the silence of the morning in two. It was a sound like a pistol shot, dry and loud, echoing off the frozen mud banks and losing itself in the dark woods beyond. The impact jarred her arms. The vibration traveled up the ash wood shaft, passing through the leather of her gloves, into her palms, her wrists, her elbows, settling as a dull ache in her shoulders. The ice did not give way immediately. It was thick, weeks of accumulated frost and frozen stillness layered upon itself. Where the iron had struck, a white starburst appeared on the dark gray surface. It was a scar of shattered crystal, opaque and powdery at the center, radiating outward in fine, jagged lines like a spider web spun from glass. The surrounding ice remained smooth, dark, and impenetrable, indifferent to the blow. She drew the bar up again. Her breath hissed through her teeth, a small sound of effort. The cloud of white mist from her lips hung suspended for a moment in the lantern light before dissipating into the gloom. She adjusted her feet on the wooden planks of the jetty. The wood was slippery with frost, and she had to plant her boots firmly, the hobnails biting into the frozen grain to find purchase. She needed stability. The river was a solid floor beneath her, but it was treacherous. She swung again. The second blow landed precisely on the center of the white starburst. Thud. This time the sound was deeper, less of a crack and more of a hollow boom that suggested the depth of the air pocket beneath the ice. Shards of ice flew up, glinting like diamonds in the yellow wash of the lantern light. They scattered across the toes of her boots, tiny, sharp fragments that looked like cut glass. The depression in the ice grew deeper. The white powder of crushed frost filled the crater she was making. It was a rhythm. Lift, pause, strike, recover, lift, pause, strike, recover. The work was monotonous, a cycle of physical exertion that required no thought, only endurance. Her mind drifted into the blank, gray space of the routine. She did not think of the cold, though it was biting at her nose and chin. She did not think of the warmth of the bed she had left. She thought only of the ice, the iron, and the water that lay waiting beneath. The wind sighed through the reeds at the riverbank. The dried stalks, brown and brittle, rattled against each other, a dry, whispering percussion to the heavy thudding of the iron bar. The lantern on the jetty cast long, wavering shadows that stretched out over the ice, mimicking her movements. The shadow of the maid was a tall, distorted giant, raising a massive hammer and bringing it down again and again upon the world. With the 10th blow, the sound changed. It became a wet, slushy crunch. The iron tip broke through the final layer of resistance. Dark water welled up instantly, rushing into the white crater, swallowing the crushed ice. It was black, oily-looking in the dim light, a stark contrast to the pale, frozen surface surrounding it. The water pulsed gently, disturbed by the intrusion, swirling with a sluggish, heavy energy. It looked infinitely cold. She did not stop. The hole was too small, barely the width of the iron bar. She needed a space wide enough to sink the great galvanized buckets. She shifted her aim, striking the ice at the edge of the new hole. Crack! A large triangular slab of ice sheared off, sliding silently under the surface of the dark water, disappearing into the depths. She struck again on the other side. Crack! Another piece broke away, bobbing for a moment before tilting and sinking. The work continued. The hole widened inch by inch. She carved a circle in the ice, chipping away at the perimeter. The water in the center grew agitated, sloshing against the jagged edges of the opening. It was a dark eye opening in the face of the frozen river, staring up at the gray sky. Her arms began to burn. The heavy wool of her dress pulled at her shoulders, the layers of fabric resisting her movements. Sweat began to form on her skin, a thin, cold sheen beneath the heavy clothes. It was a dangerous heat. If she stopped moving, the sweat would cool and freeze, turning the layers of clothing into a clammy shroud. She had to keep the rhythm. She had to keep the blood moving. The lantern flame flickered as a gust of wind swept down the river valley. The light dimmed, turning the scene into a monochrome sketch of charcoal and slate, then flared up again, painting the ice in warm hues of amber and gold. The chipped edges of the hole caught the light, glowing with an inner luminescence. The water remained black, absorbing the illumination, giving nothing back. She paused to rest for a moment, leaning on the handle of the icebreaker. Her chest rose and fell beneath the canvas apron. The air she inhaled was sharp, tasting of snow and decaying leaves. The silence of the valley rushed back in to fill the space left by the cessation of the pounding. It was a heavy silence pressing against her ears. The river was vast and still. Far downstream, the shape of a fallen tree interrupted the smooth expanse of white, a black, twisted form like the skeleton of some ancient beast. She looked at the hole she had made. It was roughly circular, jagged at the edges, about 2 feet across. The water inside was settling, the ripples dying down. It was enough. She lifted the icebreaker, the wet iron tip glistening. Drops of water fell from it, freezing almost before they hit the timber of the jetty. She wiped the metal on a patch of dry snow at the edge of the planks, cleaning it of the slush. She hung the tool back on its hook on the post. The wood groaned softly as it took the weight. Now came the water. She stepped back to where the buckets waited. They were frosted over now, the metal dull and white. She picked up the first one. The handle was freezing, the cold biting through her gloves instantly. She carried it to the edge of the jetty. She knelt down. The wood was hard and unyielding against her knees. The cold from the planks seeped through her skirts, through the petticoats, reaching her skin within seconds. She leaned over the dark water. The smell of the river was stronger here, a raw mineral scent of wet earth and deep currents. She lowered the bucket. The bottom of the metal pail hit the water with a soft slap. She tilted it. The water rushed in, a glugging, gurgling sound that seemed loud in the quiet morning. Glug, glug, glug. The bucket grew heavy, the weight increasing rapidly as the water displaced the air. It pulled at her arm, dragging her shoulder down towards the ice. When it was full, she gripped the handle with both hands. She braced her knees against the wood. She pulled. The water broke the surface, streaming off the sides of the bucket in clear, icy sheets. The weight was immense. It was dead weight, shifting and sloshing, alive with momentum. She hauled it up, the muscles of her back straining, the cords of her neck standing out. She swung it onto the jetty. It landed with a heavy, wet thud. Water splashed over the rim, hitting the wood and freezing into a slick glaze almost instantly. She breathed heavily, the white mist clouding her vision for a second. One done. She reached for the second bucket, the process repeated. The kneel, the cold seeping into the knees, the lean, the lower. The water rushed in, filling the void. The river was generous in its volume, indifferent to what was taken. The hole in the ice remained dark and open, a wound that would heal and freeze over again within an hour of her leaving. She pulled the second bucket up, the wire handle digging into her palms. She set it beside the first. She stood up slowly. Her knees were stiff, locked by the cold and the pressure. She brushed the ice crystals from her apron. She looked at the 2 buckets. They were brimming with dark, freezing water. Small shards of ice floated on the surface of each, spinning slowly in the residual current. This was the lifeblood of the house. This heavy, freezing liquid would become the tea in the fine porcelain cups, the hot water in the shaving basins, the steam rising from the porridge pot. But here now it was just a burden. She picked them up. This was the hardest moment, the transition from stillness to movement with the full weight. Her arms straightened, pulled taut by the load. Her shoulders slumped. The wire handles creaked. She took a step. The water sloshed, threatening to spill over onto her boots. She had to walk with a specific gait, a smooth, rolling stride that absorbed the motion of the water, keeping the bucket steady. She turned away from the river. The hole in the ice stared at her back, a black eye watching her retreat. She walked back along the jetty, the wood complaining under the combined weight of the woman and the water. She stepped onto the frozen mud of the bank. The ground was uneven here. She had to watch the pool of lantern light carefully, guiding her feet between the frozen ruts and the stones. A slip here would mean disaster, spilled water, soaked skirts, freezing skin, and the need to return to the river. She began the ascent. The path wound upwards through the trees, a tunnel of darkness and twisted branches. The hill was steep. Every step was a battle against gravity. The buckets pulled her backward, dragging her down towards the valley floor. She leaned forward, using her body weight to counter the load. Her boots crunched on the frozen gravel. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The rhythm was slower now, labored. The wind picked up again as she left the shelter of the valley floor. It swirled through the trees, shaking the bare branches. A fine dusting of snow, blown from the upper boughs, drifted down around her, glittering in the lantern light like diamond dust. It settled on her shawl, on the black surface of the water in the buckets, on the wool of her sleeves. She kept her eyes on the path. The world narrowed down to the small circle of light from the lantern hanging from her arm. Inside that circle, there was only frozen mud, the gray hem of her dress swinging rhythmically, and the black, trembling surface of the water. Outside the circle was the void, the vast, sleeping winter night. Her arms were beginning to go numb. The sensation started in the fingers, a dull tingling that turned to a lack of feeling, then traveled up the wrists. The wire handles felt like they were cutting directly into the bone. She shifted her grip, but there was no relief. The weight was constant. It was a physical fact, undeniable and unchangeable. She counted her steps to distract herself. 101, 102, 103. She reached a flatter section of the path, where the old stone wall of the orchard began. The wall was dry stone, built without mortar, the gaps between the rocks filled with moss and lichen. In the lantern light, the moss looked like black velvet patches on the gray stone. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wall, a low, mournful note. She paused here, setting the buckets down for a brief moment to restore the circulation to her hands. The metal clanked softly on the frozen earth. She flexed her fingers, wincing as the blood rushed back into the capillaries. It was a painful, stinging heat. She rubbed her hands together, the leather gloves making a dry, rasping sound. She looked up towards the house. It loomed above her on the hill, a massive silhouette against the lightening sky. It was still dark, but the deep indigo of the night was slowly fading to a cold, steel gray. No lights showed in the windows yet. It was a sleeping fortress, indifferent to the struggle taking place on the path below. The chimneys stood stark and straight, smokeless fingers pointing at the clouds. She could not stay long. The water would begin to freeze in the buckets. A thin skin of ice would form on the surface, splashing and cutting into the metal sides. She picked up the load again. The pain in her hands returned instantly, a sharp protest from the nerves, but she ignored it. She lifted, balanced, and stepped forward. The path grew steeper as it neared the garden gate. The ruts were deeper here, carved by the cartwheels of autumn and frozen into solid ridges of mud. She navigated them slowly, her breath coming in ragged gasps now. The steam from her exertion trailed behind her, mixing with the wind. Her legs burned. The heavy boots felt like lead weights attached to her feet. She reached the gate. It was still ajar as she had left it. She maneuvered through the opening, careful not to let the buckets hit the posts. The iron latch caught on her sleeve, snagging the wool, but she pulled free with a sharp tug. She was in the yard now. The cobblestones were treacherous. The verglas ice was even slicker than before. She shortened her stride, shuffling her feet to maintain balance. The lantern swung wildly, the light pitching and rolling across the yard like a ship in a storm. The shadows of the rain barrel and the woodpile leaped and retreated on the walls. She approached the back door. It stood closed, the dark wood solid and imposing. She had to set the buckets down to open it. She lowered them carefully to the stone step. Clink, clink. She reached for the handle, her fingers were stiff, clumsy with the cold. She fumbled with the latch, the metal slipping under her thumb. She tried again, focusing all her will on the small movement. The latch clicked. She pushed. The door swung inward, revealing the scullery. It was exactly as she had left it, but now, compared to the biting wind of the yard, it felt almost sheltered. The single candle she had left burning in the lantern on the bench had burned low, the flame a small blue bead in a pool of wax. The room was dim, filled with shadows. She picked up the buckets one last time. She stepped over the threshold, dragging the weight of the river into the house. She kicked the door shut behind her with her heel. The heavy thud of the closing door shut out the wind, the sound of the trees, and the vast, empty night. The silence of the house returned, but it was a different silence, still, stale, and waiting. She carried the buckets to the large stone sink. She did not pour them yet. They were heavy, and she needed a moment. She set them down on the floor. The water settled, the surface glossing over, reflecting the dying light of the candle. She stood there, her chest heaving, her arms hanging limp at her sides. Her hands were curled into permanent hooks, the memory of the wire handles etched into her palms. She unwrapped her shawl. The wool was damp with melted snow and the moisture of her breath. She hung it on the peg by the door. She untied her bonnet, her hair escaping in loose, damp strands around her face. Her cheeks were burning with the transition from the freezing wind to the still air of the scullery. They tingled and stung, a flushed red in the gloom. The scullery was cold, but it was not the aggressive, biting cold of the river. It was a passive chill rising from the stones. She walked to the coal pile in the corner. The next task waited. The water was here, but it was useless without fire. The range had to be lit. The monster had to be fed. She picked up the coal scuttle. It was a battered metal bucket, black with dust. She took the small iron shovel. The coal shifted with a harsh, grating sound as she dug into the pile. It was dusty work. The fine black powder rose in the air, coating her throat, tasting of carbon and earth. She filled the scuttle, the lumps of coal clattering against the metal sides. She carried the coal through the silent kitchen. The copper pan still gleamed dully in the shadows. The great table was still white and empty. She approached the range. It was a wall of black iron, cold and dead. She knelt before the grate. The ashes of yesterday were gray and lifeless. She took the poker and riddled the grate, the ash falling through into the pan below with a soft shush-shush sound. The dust billowed out, smelling of spent fire. She reached for the kindling box. Small sticks of dry pine split fine. She arranged them in the grate, building a small pyramid structure. It was an architecture of fire, a precise arrangement to encourage the flame. She crumbled old newspaper, the paper dry and brittle, rustling loudly. She stuffed it beneath the wood. She struck a match. The flare of light illuminated the inside of the grate, revealing the soot-caked iron bricks at the back. She touched the flame to the paper. It caught instantly, curling and browning, then bursting into yellow flame. The fire spread to the wood, the pine crackling and popping as the resin boiled. The smoke rose, drawn up the chimney by the draft. She watched the fire for a moment. It was the first true warmth of the day. a small, flickering heart in the center of the cold house. She added a few smaller lumps of coal, placing them carefully with her fingers, building a bridge over the flames. The coal hissed as it heated, then began to smoke. She stood up. The kitchen was still dark, but the fire cast a dancing orange glow on the floor. She went back to the scullery. She picked up one of the heavy buckets of water. She walked back to the range. There was a large iron kettle permanently suspended over the hot plate, and a boiler built into the side of the range. She lifted the bucket. It was a struggle to raise it to the height of the range. She rested the rim on the iron lip of the boiler. She tipped it. The water poured out, a heavy, clear stream cascading into the dark depths of the tank. It sounded hollow, echoing in the metal chamber. She poured until the bucket was empty, shaking the last few drops into the boiler. She did the same with the kettle, filling it through the spout. The sound of the water changing pitch as the vessel filled, from a deep, hollow drum to a high, tight ring. Glug, 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 ping. She set the empty buckets down. They were light now, almost weightless. She looked at her hands. They were red and raw, the knuckles swollen, covered in coal dust and streaks of water. They were the hands of the house, the tools that made the comfort of others possible. She returned to the scullery. There was more to do. The vegetables for the day needed to be prepared. The scullery sink was full of unwashed potatoes, covered in dried mud. They were frozen hard like stones. She would have to scrub them in the cold water. She took a small knife from the drawer. The handle was wood, worn smooth. The blade was thin, sharpened to a needle point. She picked up a potato. It was cold, smelling of earth. She turned on the tap above the sink. A trickle of water came out. Gravity fed from the cistern she had filled days ago, which was now nearly empty. It was icy. She began to scrape. The mud dissolved under the water, turning the stream brown. The knife scratched against the skin of the potato. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was rhythmic, abrasive. The water ran over her hands, numbing them again. The warmth of the fire in the other room seemed a mile away. Here there was only the stone sink, the cold water, and the pile of dirty roots. The window of the scullery was beginning to lighten. The frost on the glass was losing its gray pallor and turning a translucent white. The sun was rising somewhere, far away, behind the banks of heavy clouds. It would not bring warmth, but it would bring light. It would expose the dust in the corners, the stains on the floor, the endlessness of the work. She worked methodically. One potato finished, dropped into a clean bowl of water, another picked up. The mud scrubbed away. The skin peeled, the eyes gouged out. The repetition was a trance. Her mind emptied. There was no past, no future, only the potato in her hand, only the cold water, only the sound of the knife. The lantern on the bench finally sputtered and died. The wick had burned down to nothing. The flame gave a last, desperate leap and then vanished, leaving a trail of acrid smoke. She did not stop working. The gray light from the window was enough now. It was a flat, shadowless light that made everything look old and worn. It washed out the colors, turning the red brick to a dull rust, the yellow stone to gray. She finished the potatoes. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving wet, muddy streaks on the coarse canvas. She looked at the row of cleaned vegetables, white and stark in the water. They were ready. She walked back into the kitchen. The fire in the range had taken hold. The coal was glowing red at the center, radiating a steady heat. The iron front of the stove was beginning to tick and ping as it expanded. The kettle was silent, but soon it would begin to sing. She stood in front of the range, holding her hands out to the warmth. She did not stand too close. She did not presume to claim the fire. She just borrowed the edge of its heat. She watched the flames licking behind the bars of the grate. They were hypnotic, shifting shapes of orange and yellow. The house was waking up. She could hear sounds from above. The creak of a floorboard, the distant thud of a door closing. The butler would be down soon. The housekeeper would appear with her keys. The day would begin in earnest. The silence would be broken by voices, by orders, by the clatter of china and silver. But for now, for this last fragment of the morning, it was still hers. The kitchen was her kingdom of shadows and fire. She took a deep breath. The air here was warmer, smelling of coal smoke and drying wool. She turned away from the fire. There was the floor to be swept. The stone flags were dusty. She picked up the broom from the corner. It was made of stiff twigs bound together. She began to sweep, swish, swish, swish. The sound was soft, soothing. She moved the dust across the floor, gathering it into a pile. The rhythm of the sweeping joined the rhythm of the fire, the rhythm of the wind outside, the rhythm of the house breathing. It was a continuous loop. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. The ice, the water, the fire, the dust. She swept around the legs of the great table. She swept near the pantry door. She swept the path she had walked with the coal scuttle. She was erasing the traces of her own labor, making the room perfect for those who would enter later. She was the invisible force that kept the world turning, the silent engine in the dark. She reached the scullery door again. She looked back at the kitchen. It was ready. The water was boiling. The fire was roaring. The floor was clean. She had broken the river ice and she had brought the life into the house. She leaned the broom against the wall. She felt a heaviness in her legs, a dull ache that was always there, buried deep in the muscles. She ignored it. There was no time for tiredness. She looked at the small window in the scullery door. Through the frost-clear patch she had melted with her breath earlier, she could see the yard. The sky was a pale, hard blue now. The sun had broken the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the cobblestones. The frost was blindingly white. It was a beautiful, cruel morning. She turned back to the sink. The dishes from the night before were waiting. A stack of greasy plates crusted with sauce, a pile of silverware. This was the scullery maid's true domain, the cleaning of the aftermath. She rolled up her sleeves further, exposing her forearms. They were red, chapped from the cold and the water. She reached for the bar of rough yellow soap. She turned on the tap again. The water was still freezing. She did not flinch. She picked up the first plate. The water in the deep stone sink was a clouded gray mirror. It reflected nothing but the vague, shifting shadows of the scullery ceiling and the dull glint of the taps. The maid stood before it, her body angled slightly to gain leverage against the depth of the basin. The stack of plates on the wooden draining board was a tower of white ceramic, each one rimmed with a delicate, faded blue pattern of vines and flowers, a garden that never bloomed, frozen in the glaze. They were cold to the touch, retaining the chill of the pantry where they had spent the night. The grease from the previous evening's meal had congealed on the surface of the porcelain, forming opaque, white smears that clung stubbornly to the smooth finish. It was the refuse of a feast she had not seen, the remnants of pleasure reduced to a cleaning task. She reached for the block of soda. It was a rough, caustic square of cleaning agent, yellow-white and hard as a brick. She rubbed a wet rag against it, the friction creating a thin, gritty lather that smelled sharp and chemical, stinging the nose. The smell cut through the damp, earthy odor of the scullery, a scent of aggressive cleanliness. She picked up the first plate. It was heavy, made of thick ironstone china, designed to survive the handling of servants. She plunged it into the water. The water was lukewarm now, tempered by a jug she had fetched from the boiler, but it was rapidly cooling against the mass of the cold stone sink. The rag moved in circles, swirl, swirl, swirl. The motion was mechanical. Her hand knew the curve of the rim, the dip of the center, the ridge of the foot. She scrubbed at the solidified fat, the soda biting into the grease, breaking it down into gray streaks that floated away in the water. The silence of the scullery was broken only by the soft slosh of the water and the occasional clink of china against the stone sides of the sink. It was a small, contained sound, a domestic percussion that marked the passage of minutes. She rinsed the plate under the cold tap. The water ran clear and freezing over the white surface, washing away the gray suds. She held it up for a second, checking for spots in the dim light. It gleamed wet and stark. She placed it in the wooden rack to her left. Then she reached for the next one. The rhythm reasserted itself. Reach, scrub, rinse. Rack, reach, scrub, rinse. Rack. It was a cycle of erasure, removing the evidence of the past to prepare for the future. The light in the room was shifting very slowly. The gray rectangle of the window was brightening, the frost losing its blue tint and becoming a flat paper white. The sun was trying to push through the heavy winter overcast, but it was a weak, diffused effort. The shadows in the corners of the room did not retreat. They merely softened, turning from black ink to charcoal dust. The texture of the brick walls became more defined, the roughness of the mortar standing out in the sidelight. From the kitchen beyond the open door, a new sound emerged. It was the soft shuffle of feet on flagstones, lighter than her own hobnailed boots. The kitchen maid had descended. There was no greeting, no cheerful morning salutation. In this house at this hour, silence was a rule as rigid as the iron bars of the grate. Words were unnecessary energy, a waste of breath better saved for labor. The scullery maid did not turn her head. She continued to scrub, her focus entirely on the plate in her hand. She heard the sounds of the kitchen coming to life. The heavy iron lid of the range was lifted with a metallic clang. The roar of the fire grew louder for a moment, then was muffled again as coal was poured in from the scullery bucket. The sound of the kettle being shifted, the scrape of iron on iron. The kitchen maid was preparing the tea for the upper servants. The hierarchy of the house was asserting itself. First the fires, then the water, then the tea for the housekeeper and the butler, then the breakfast for the family, and finally the scraps for the lowest. The smell of toast began to drift into the scullery. It was a warm, dry scent, the smell of bread browning over hot coals. It was a comforting aroma, but also a distant one. It belonged to the other room, to the realm of warmth and light. Here in the scullery the air still smelled of wet stone, soda, and the metallic tang of the plumbing. The scullery maid's stomach gave a quiet, hollow rumble, a physical reminder of the emptiness inside. She ignored it. Hunger was just another sensation like the cold, to be acknowledged and then set aside. She finished the stack of plates. Her hands were red and wrinkled from the water, the skin puckering at the fingertips. She wiped them on her apron, the coarse canvas absorbing the moisture but leaving the chill. She turned to the next pile, the saucepans. These were copper lined with tin. They were heavy, blackened on the bottom by the fire, crusted with the dried remains of sauces and gravies on the inside. They required more than a rag. They required sand. She walked to the cupboard under the sink and pulled out a wooden box filled with fine, white silica sand. She took a handful. It felt dry and flowing, like cold sugar, slipping through her fingers. She threw it into the first pan. She added a splash of water and a wad of vinegar-soaked cloth. She began to scour. The sound was harsh. Scritch-scratch, scritch-scratch. It was the sound of abrasion, of wearing down. The sand ground against the copper, stripping away the tarnish and the burnt food. It required force. She had to lean her weight into the pan, pressing down with her shoulder, driving her hand around the circumference of the metal. The copper began to glow dully under the grime, revealing its warm, orange-pink color. It was a hidden beauty, buried under the soot, revealed only by hard labor. The kitchen maid appeared in the doorway. She was young, her face pale and sleep-creased, her cap slightly askew. She held a large brown earthenware teapot in her hands. She did not speak. She simply placed a chipped enamel mug on the edge of the draining board and poured a stream of dark, steaming liquid into it. Tea. It was the second brewing, weak and bitter, made from the leaves left over after the upper servant's pot had been filled. But it was hot. Steam rose from the mug, curling into the cold air of the scullery. The kitchen maid turned and left, her footsteps retreating back into the warmth. The scullery maid stopped scouring. She reached for the mug with a wet, sandy hand. The enamel was hot against her skin, a sudden, shocking warmth that made her fingers throb. She lifted it to her lips. The tea tasted of tannins and iron, with no sugar to soften it, no milk to cool it. It scalded her tongue, a sharp pain that was also a pleasure. She drank it quickly, gulping down the heat, feeling it travel down her throat and into her chest, a thin line of fire in the center of her cold body. She set the mug down. It was empty. The warmth was fleeting, already fading as the cold air reclaimed her. She picked up the scouring cloth again. The sand waited. The pans waited. Outside, the wind had shifted. It was no longer a steady moan, but a series of gusting bouffets that slammed against the stone walls of the house. The window pane rattled in its lead frame, a nervous, chattering sound. The light was fully gray now, a flat, sunless daylight that revealed the age of the scullery. It showed the cracks in the ceiling plaster, the spider webs in the high corners that she would have to sweep down later, the stains on the limestone floor. It was a light without mercy. The bell rang. It was a sharp, jangling sound from the row of bells mounted high on the wall in the passage outside the kitchen. The metal clapper struck the bronze cup of the bell, swinging on its coiled spring. Jingle, jangle, jingle. It was the bell for the housemaid. Somewhere upstairs, a hand had pulled a cord. A desire had been registered. A command had been sent through the wires hidden in the walls. The house was awake. The scullery maid did not look up. That bell was not for her. Her bells were the silent ones, the empty coal scuttle, the dry boiler, the dirty pan. She continued to scour the copper. The pile of clean pans grew on the shelf, a row of glowing orange moons in the darkness. Once the pans were done, she moved to the knives. They were steel, not stainless. They stained gray if left wet, rusted if left damp. They had to be cleaned with brick dust. She laid a leather board on the bench. She sprinkled the red dust onto the leather. She took a knife, pressing the flat of the blade against the board. She rubbed it back and forth. Swish F-watt, swish F-watt. The friction polished the steel, removing the gray oxidation, bringing back the silver shine. It was a hypnotic motion, back and forth, back and forth. The dust turned black as it mixed with the metal filings. Her mind drifted. It did not go to places of fantasy or hope. It stayed within the confines of the house, moving through the rooms she would never enter as a guest. She imagined the dining room, the heavy velvet curtains being drawn back, the silver coffee pot gleaming on the sideboard. She imagined the library, the fire crackling in the marble hearth, the smell of old leather books. She imagined the bedrooms, the eider-down quilts being smoothed, the porcelain basins being filled with the water she had carried. She was the ghost in the machine. the invisible current that powered this ecosystem of comfort. The back door opened again. This time it was the boot boy. He entered from the yard, bringing a gust of cold air and the smell of the stables, straw, manure, and leather. He carried a basket of logs for the fires. He was a small figure, bundled in a rough coat that was too big for him. He stomped his boots on the mat, shaking off the snow. He did not look at the scullery maid. He walked through the scullery, his breath clouding in the air, and disappeared into the kitchen. The cold draft he brought lingered, swirling around the maid's ankles, finding the gap between her stockings and her boots. She finished the knives. She gathered them up, a bouquet of steel, and carried them into the kitchen. The room was warmer now, significantly so. The range was radiating a solid wall of heat. The smell of cooking was stronger, bacon now, salty and rich, frying in a heavy iron pan. The cook was there, a formidable shape in white, moving between the table and the stove. She was a planet around which the kitchen maid orbited. The scullery maid placed the knives on the designated table and retreated immediately. She did not belong in the warmth. Her place was the cold perimeter. Back in the scullery, she looked at the floor. It was wet with splashes from the sink and tracked with muddy footprints from the boot boy. It needed to be scrubbed. She fetched the pail. She filled it with hot water from the boiler this time, allowing herself this small luxury because the grease on the floor required it. She added soft soap, a gelatinous brown goo that smelled of potash. She took the scrubbing brush, a wooden block with stiff bristles of basin fiber. She knelt on the wet stone. This was the posture of her life, kneeling. The stone was hard, pressing into her kneecaps through the layers of her petticoats. She dipped the brush into the hot, soapy water. She began to scrub. The motion was circular, expansive. She threw her weight forward, driving the bristles into the pores of the stone, then pulled back. Scrub shhh. Scrub shhh. The soap created a gray foam on the flags. She worked methodically, starting from the corner farthest from the door and working backwards. She was scrubbing away the footprints, the coal dust, the spilled water. She was purifying the stone. The sound of the scrubbing was a low, rhythmic rasping. It filled the small room. Down here, close to the floor, the smell of the damp earth was stronger. The scullery was built directly on the ground. There was no cellar beneath it. The cold of the soil seeped up through the flags. As the hot water cooled on the stone, it released a vapor that smelled of wet limestone and ancient dust. She scrubbed a square yard, then wiped it dry with a heavy floor cloth. She wrung the cloth out into the bucket, the water turning black. She moved to the next square yard. It was a game of territory, claiming the floor back from the dirt, foot by foot. Her back began to ache, a dull, burning pain in the lumbar region. It was a familiar companion. She adjusted her posture, rocking back on her heels for a moment to stretch the muscles, then bent forward again. There was no stopping. To stop was to let the water cool, to let the soap dry, to let the dirt win. In the kitchen, voices were raised. The cook was giving orders. The eggs, the toast, the tray for the blue room. The words were sharp, distinct, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. They were the sounds of urgency. But in the scullery there was no urgency, only the steady, slow tempo of the scrubbing brush. The scullery existed in a different time, a slower, heavier time. She reached the space under the sink. It was dark here, a cave of shadows. She had to crouch low, her cheek almost touching the wet stone to reach the back corners. She scrubbed blindly, trusting the brush to find the dirt. She encountered a small, dead beetle curled into a dry husk. She swept it into the cloth, dust to dust. As she worked, she listened to the house. The heavy thud of the front door closing, someone leaving. No, the postman arriving. the sound of heavy boots on the front steps, then the lighter, quick steps of the footman going to retrieve the mail. The house was a living organism, pulsing with these small movements. She was the heartbeat that no one heard, the slow, steady pulse that kept the fluids moving, the waste clearing. She reached the door to the yard. She scrubbed the threshold, the stone worn smooth by years of passage. The wind whistled under the door, blowing the soap suds back towards her. She fought against the draft, drying the stone vigorously. She stood up. Her knees cracked. She picked up the bucket of dirty water. It was heavy, gray, and sludge-thick. She carried it to the sink and poured it down the drain. The sound was a thick, glugging gurgle as the filth vanished into the pipes, returning to the earth. She rinsed the bucket. She rinsed the brush. She hung the floor cloth to dry on the wooden rack. The floor was clean. It was damp, drying slowly in the cool air, smelling of soap. It was a slate-gray expanse of order. She looked at it with a lack of satisfaction, but with a sense of completion. It was done, for now. In an hour, someone would walk across it. The boot boy would return. The coal would be dragged through. The cycle would begin again. But for this moment, it was clean. She walked to the wooden stool in the corner and sat down for the first time since she had dressed. She rested her hands in her lap. They were red, swollen, and trembling slightly from the exertion. She stared at them. They looked like foreign objects, tools made of meat and bone that belonged to the house more than they belonged to her. The nails were short, broken, rimmed with the gray of the scouring sand. The skin was rough as parchment. She closed her eyes for a second. The darkness behind her eyelids was a relief from the gray world. In the darkness, she could feel the heat of the kitchen fire radiating through the doorway, a faint, distant warmth on her left cheek. She could hear the wind outside, still prowling around the corners of the house, looking for a way in. She could hear the ticking of the clock in the kitchen, a slow, deliberate tock, tock, tock. It was mid-morning. The long stretch of the day lay ahead. The vegetables for lunch, the washing of the breakfast dishes, the scrubbing of the front steps, the polishing of the brass, the mountains of labor that had to be climbed one step at a time. She opened her eyes. The scullery remained. The stone sink, the copper pans, the brick walls, a still life of service. She stood up. The respite was over. The silence was waiting to be filled with the sound of work. She walked to the larder door. It was time to fetch the vegetables. The carrots, the turnips, the onions. The roots of the earth that needed to be washed, peeled, and chopped. She opened the door. The smell of raw earth and cold storage washed over her. It was a smell of winter preserved. She stepped inside the dark, cool room. The shelves were lined with sacks and crates. She reached for a sack of carrots. The burlap was rough, scratching her fingers. She dragged it out into the scullery light. The day moved on. The sun rose higher behind the gray clouds, but the light in the scullery remained the same, a dim, underwater gloom. The maid moved through it like a deep-sea diver, slow, weighted, and silent. The sack of carrots was a heavy, slumping mass of rough burlap, settled on the stone floor like a dormant animal. The fabric was coarse, woven from thick jute fibers that shed a fine, microscopic dust when moved, adding a layer of haze to the low light of the scullery. She untied the string at the neck of the sack. The knot was tight, stiffened by dampness and time, resisting her fingers. She worked at it patiently, her nails picking at the fibers, until the loop loosened and the mouth of the sack fell open. Inside, the carrots lay in a jumbled heap, coated in the dark, dry soil of the fields from which they had been pulled weeks ago. They smelled of the cellar, a deep, earthy root smell that was sweet and damp, the scent of stored winter energy. She reached in and pulled out a handful. They were cold, hard as wood and covered in grit. She dropped them into the stone sink, the sound of the roots hitting the stone a dull, wooden clatter. Clack, thud, clack. She repeated the motion until the bottom of the sink was covered in a layer of the dirty orange roots. They looked dull and lifeless under the coating of earth, their color muted to a rust brown in the gloom of the room. She turned on the tap. The water that emerged was a thin, clear cylinder of ice-cold liquid. It splashed onto the carrots, darkening the soil, turning the dry dust into mud. The smell of wet earth rose immediately, filling the small space of the scullery, overpowering the lingering scent of the soda and soap from the floor cleaning. It was the smell of the garden in November, of rain-soaked fields and cold clay. She picked up the vegetable brush. It was a block of wood with stiff, brown bristles that had been worn down by years of friction. She picked up the first carrot. She held it under the stream of water. The cold was instantaneous, wrapping around her fingers, numbing the skin. She began to scrub. The sound was a rough, rhythmic rasping. Scrub, scrub, scrub. The bristles dug into the dirt, scouring the surface of the vegetable. The mud dissolved, washing away in brown rivulets that swirled down the drain. As the dirt vanished, the color of the carrot was revealed. It was not a bright, vibrant orange, but a deep, burnished ochre, shadowed and textured like an old drawing. The skin was pitted and scarred, marked by the soil and the spade. She scrubbed the top, where the green tops had been sheared off, leaving a blackened circle. She scrubbed the tip, which tapered to a thin, rat-tail root. When it was clean, she placed it in a bowl of clear water. It sank to the bottom, magnifying slightly in the liquid. She picked up the next one. The rhythm established itself again. Pick up, rinse, scrub, rinse, drop. It was a cycle of revelation, uncovering the hidden color beneath the grime. Her hands moved with a practiced economy, wasting no motion. The water ran continuously, a constant, low-level hiss that became the background static of the room. Her fingers turned red, then white, as the blood retreated from the surface to the core, preserving heat. She did not stop to warm them. The carrots had to be done. The cook was waiting. The pile in the sink diminished, and the pile in the bowl grew. A submerged harvest of orange shapes glowing dimly in the water. When the last carrot was scrubbed, she turned off the tap. The silence returned, sudden and heavy, amplified by the cessation of the rushing water. The only sound was the drip of the tap, a slow metronomic plink, plink, plink that landed in the muddy residue at the bottom of the sink. She took the bowl of clean carrots to the wooden workbench. She set it down beside a wooden board. She took the small paring knife again. Now came the peeling. She picked up a wet carrot. She held it by the thick end. She set the blade against the skin near her thumb. She pulled the knife down the length of the root. A long, thin strip of skin curled away from the blade. It was translucent, revealing the brighter, moist flesh beneath. Swish. The sound was a soft whisper of steel against vegetable. The peel fell onto the bench. She turned the carrot slightly. Swish. Another strip. She worked around the circumference, faceting the cylinder, turning the rough, pitted surface into a smooth, geometric shape. The smell of the cut carrot was sharper, sweeter. It was a fresh, green scent that cut through the stale air. The peels piled up on the wood, a tangle of orange ribbons that looked like fallen autumn leaves. The motion of the knife was hypnotic. Down, turn, down, turn, down, turn. Her eyes followed the blade, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting in the gray space of routine. She was not thinking of the carrot or the meal it would become part of. She was simply the mechanism that removed the skin. One by one, the carrots were transformed. They lay in a new bowl, naked and bright, uniform in their preparation. The pile of peels grew large, a wet, chaotic mass. When she finished the last one, she gathered the peels in her hands, cold, wet, and slimy, and threw them into the slop bucket under the bench. This bucket was for the pigs. Nothing was wasted. The energy of the sun, stored in the root, would feed the house, and the skin of the root would feed the animals. It was a closed circle. Next were the turnips. She went back to the larder. The turnips were in a crate, heavy, round globes of purple and white. They were solid, dense as stones. She carried 4 of them to the sink. They were cleaner than the carrots, but still dusted with dry soil. She washed them, the water sliding off their waxy skins. They were cold objects, retaining the chill of the earth deep within their dense white flesh. Peeling a turnip was different. The skin was thicker, tougher. It required more force. The knife had to bite deeper. She had to saw slightly to get the blade started. The sound was different, a crunching, tearing sound as the knife separated the thick rind from the meat. The flesh inside was stark white, gleaming like ivory in the lantern light. It smelled of mustard and damp soil, a pungent, aggressive odor. She quartered the turnips. The knife required significant pressure to slice through the center. She leaned her weight onto the handle. Crunch. The vegetables split. The 2 halves fell apart on the board, rocking slightly. She cut them again. Cubes of white turnip joined the carrots in the water. The colors mixed, deep orange and stark white, a study in root vegetables. Then the onions. A net bag of yellow onions hung on a hook. She took down several. Their skins were dry, brittle, and papery. They rustled as she touched them, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. They were golden brown, shedding flakes of skin that floated in the air like moths. She placed an onion on the board. She cut off the top and the root end. The knife sliced through the paper skin with a dry crackle. She scored the side. She used her thumb to peel away the outer layers. The dry skin came away, revealing the moist, pale, green-white sphere underneath. The scent hit her instantly, sulphurous, stinging, potent. It watered the eyes, pricking at the tear ducts. She blinked, her eyes tearing up, but she did not stop. It was just a physical reaction, a reflex. She sliced the onion in half. She laid the flat side down on the board. She began to chop, 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 rapid, precise strokes. The knife hit the wood of the board with a sharp percussion. The onion fell apart into uniform arcs. She swept them into a separate bowl. The smell filled the scullery, strong and biting, masking the smell of the damp stone and the coal smoke. It hung in the air, a visible presence almost, heavy and acidic. She finished the vegetables. The prep work was done. The bowls were full. She carried them into the kitchen. The cook was there, standing by the range, her face flushed from the heat. The kitchen was a different world now. It was hot, humid, and loud with the sounds of cooking. A large pot of water was boiling on the stove, rolling with a deep, chaotic energy. Pans were sizzling. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat. A joint of beef was in the oven. The scullery maid placed the bowls on the table. The cook nodded, a barely perceptible dip of the chin. It was the only acknowledgement she would receive. The maid turned and retreated, back through the green baize door, back to the silence, back to the cold. She returned to the scullery. The workbench was covered in onion skins and turnip peels. She swept them into the slop bucket. She wiped the board down with a wet cloth, scrubbing away the onion juice and the carrot stains. She rinsed the cloth. She cleaned the knife, polishing the blade until the steel shone again. She looked at the window. The light had changed again. It was noon or close to it. The sun was at its highest point, though still hidden behind the gray blanket of clouds. The light in the scullery was at its peak, a dull, flat illumination that reached into the corners but cast no defined shadows. The frost on the window had melted on the inside, running down the glass in long, weeping trails of water that pooled on the sill. Outside, the world remained frozen, a landscape of iron and ice. She felt the tiredness now. It was a dull ache in the small of her back, a heaviness in her legs. She had been moving since before dawn. She had moved tons of water, coal, and vegetables. Her body was a machine that was beginning to run low on fuel, but there was no stopping. The bell rang again. This time it was the dining room bell. Lunch was being served upstairs. This meant that soon the wave would return. The tide of dirty dishes would flow back down the stairs, through the kitchen, and crash into the scullery. Prepared the sink. She drained the cold, muddy water from the vegetable washing. She scrubbed the sediment from the bottom of the basin. She plugged the drain. She went to the boiler. She filled the large jug with steaming hot water. She poured it into the sink. The steam rose in a dense white cloud, obscuring the taps, filling the room with warmth and moisture. It condensed on the cold walls, making the bricks sweat. She added more soda. She added soap. She created a hot, caustic bath, waiting for the arrival. She heard the footsteps first. The heavy tread of the footman, muffled by the green baize door, then clattering loud on the stone passage. The door swung open. He entered, carrying a large wooden tray piled high with silver and china. He did not speak. He set the tray down on the draining board with a heavy rattle of crockery. He turned and left, his coat-tails swinging. The tray was a landscape of devastation. Fine-boned china plates were smeared with the remnants of the meal, streaks of brown gravy, half-eaten potatoes, crumbs of bread, bones of fish or fowl. Crystal glasses held the dregs of wine, ruby-red pools in the bottom of the glass. Silver forks and knives were tangled together, greasy and stained. It was a picture of excess brought down to the level of refuse. The smell was rich and overpowering: roasted meat, wine, heavy sauces. It clashed violently with the clean, chemical smell of the scullery. For a moment the maid just looked at it. The contrast between her own hunger, a hollow, gnawing sensation in her stomach, and the wasted food on the plates was sharp. A half-eaten roll, a piece of beef left on the side of a plate. It was food, perfectly good food, now destined for the swill bucket or the fire. She began the sorting. This was a critical step. The silver could not scratch the china. The crystal could not touch the ironstone. She separated the cutlery, dropping the silver forks and spoons into a soaking jug of hot, soapy water. She scraped the plates. She took a wooden scraper and pushed the leftover food into the slop bucket. Scrape, plop, scrape, plop. The mound of wet waste in the bucket grew, a mixture of potato, meat, and gravy. She stacked the scraped plates. She lined up the glasses. Then the washing began. She plunged her hands into the water. It was hot, scaldingly hot. She bit her lip. The heat was necessary to cut the grease. If the water was too cool, the fat would just smear, coating everything in a dull film. She held the first plate underwater. The sponge moved in circles. The gravy dissolved, turning the dishwater a murky brown. The delicate floral pattern of the china emerged from the grease, clean and shining. She worked quickly. The water would cool. The grease would harden. Speed was essential. Reach, scrub, rinse, rack. The movements were identical to the morning's wash, but the objects were more delicate. These plates were thin, translucent if held up to the light. They were fragile. A slip of the fingers, a moment of clumsiness, and they would shatter. And breakage was a sin that would be paid for from her wages, wages that barely existed. The fear of breaking was a constant, low-level tension in her muscles. It made her grip precise, her movements calculated. She handled the crystal glasses with extreme care. She washed them one by one, sliding the sponge inside the bowl, rubbing the rim. She rinsed them in a separate bowl of very hot, clear water. She set them upside down on a clean linen cloth to drain. They caught the gray light from the window, sparkling with a cold, hard brilliance. The steam from the sink softened the air in the room. Her hair, escaped from her cap, curled in the dampness, sticking to her forehead. Sweat pricked at her hairline. Her apron was soaked across the front, dark with water and splashes of grease. Her hands were red and wrinkled, soaked in the alkali solution of the soda. More trays arrived, the vegetable dishes, the gravy boat, the meat platter, the soup tureen. The volume of dishes seemed impossible for the number of people upstairs. Every course required a fresh plate. Every side dish required a serving bowl. It was a parade of ceramic and silver. The water in the sink grew thick and greasy. She pulled the plug. The dirty water swirled away, a vortex of brown scum. She refilled the sink. Fresh hot water, fresh soda. The cycle reset. She lost track of time. There was only the next plate, the next fork, the next glass. The world narrowed down to the soapy water and the ceramic circle in her hands. The sounds of the house faded away. The wind outside was forgotten. There was only the clink of the china and the swish of the water. Finally, the flow stopped. The footman did not return. The last tray was empty. The draining board was full of clean, wet dishes. The rack was stacked high. The linen cloth was covered in gleaming glass. She began the drying. This was a different rhythm. She took a clean tea towel. She picked up a plate. She rubbed it dry. Circle, flip, circle. The cloth absorbed the moisture. The china squeaked softly as it became dry. She polished it, holding it up to the light to check for smears. It had to be perfect. She stacked the dry plates. She polished the silver, rubbing away the water spots until the metal mirrored the gray room. She polished the glasses, holding them by the stem, twirling them in the cloth. They chimed softly, a musical note in the quiet room. When it was all done, the scullery was filled with stacks of clean, shining crockery. It looked like a showroom. The chaos of the meal had been erased. Order had been restored. She wiped down the draining board. She wiped down the sink. She wrung out the cloths and hung them to dry. She looked at the slop bucket. It was full to the brim with the waste of the lunch. It needed to be emptied. She picked up the heavy bucket. The handle dug into her hand. She walked to the back door. She opened it. The cold air rushed in, shocking after the humidity of the dishwashing. It felt crisp and clean, cleansing the lungs. She stepped out into the yard. The sun was beginning its descent, though it had never really shown itself. The light was shifting, growing bluer, deeper. The shadows were lengthening again. The frost on the cobblestones had not melted. It had merely hardened. She walked to the swill bin at the edge of the yard. She lifted the bucket and tipped it. The contents poured out with a wet slap, a chaotic mix of orange peels, white turnip skins, brown gravy, and bread. It was a colorful, steaming mess against the frozen ground. She turned back to the house. The scullery door was a dark rectangle in the stone wall. A faint yellow light was glowing inside. The cook must have lit the lamp in the kitchen, and the light was spilling through. She walked back, her boots crunching on the ice. The afternoon was settling in. The heavy, slow afternoon of the winter, the time of waiting, the time of shadows. She entered the scullery and closed the door. She was alone again. The dishes were done. The vegetables were done. The floor was done. But the copper was tarnishing in the air. The coal was burning down in the grate. The water was cooling in the pipes. She sat on the stool. She rested her head against the cool brick of the wall. She closed her eyes. She listened to the silence. It was heavy, textured, and deep. It was the sound of a house that was resting between breaths. The brief respite on the wooden stool was not a cessation of labor, but merely a pause in the visible movement of the body. Even in stillness, the maid was part of the room's heavy, silent architecture. She sat with her hands resting on the coarse wool of her apron, the fingers curled loosely, retaining the shape of the handles they had gripped all morning, the bucket wire, the knife haft, the scrubbing brush. Her breath was the only thing that moved with freedom, rising and falling in a slow, shallow rhythm that barely disturbed the air. The brick wall against her back was a solid slab of cold, drawing the heat from her spine through the layers of her dress and stays. It was a grounding sensation, a reminder that the house was made of stone and earth, and that she was merely a temporary warmth within it. She opened her eyes. The gray light in the room had shifted again. The sun, which had never truly broken through the cloud cover, was beginning its early, sliding descent towards the horizon. It was mid-afternoon, that deep, hollow part of the winter day where the light begins to fail almost as soon as it has arrived. The rectangle of the window was no longer a flat white. It was deepening into a bruised slate blue, the color of a frozen ocean. The shadows in the corners of the scullery were lengthening, stretching out like dark pools of ink, reclaiming the territory they had lost during the brief brightness of noon. She stood up. The movement was stiff, her joints clicking softly in the quiet. The stool scraped against the stone floor, a harsh, dry sound. She pushed it back into its corner. The rest was over. The silence of the afternoon was not a silence of emptiness, but a silence of accumulation. Dust was settling. Tarnish was forming. The invisible forces of decay were at work, and her duty was to hold them back. She looked at the brass taps above the stone sink. They were dull, their golden shine obscured by the splash marks of the morning's water and the oxidation of the damp air. They looked tired, coated in a thin film of neglect. They needed to be bright. Brass was the jewelry of the scullery, the one element that was permitted to shine in the gloom. She walked to the cupboard beneath the sink. The air inside smelt of damp wood and mouse dust. She reached into the dark and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a tin of polishing paste and a collection of rags, old strips of linen torn from worn-out sheets, soft and gray with age. The paste was a thick, reddish-brown substance, smelling of ammonia and rotten stone. It was a sharp, chemical scent that cleared the head, cutting through the heavy, earthy atmosphere of the room. She took a rag and wrapped it around her index finger. She dipped it into the tin, scooping up a small amount of the gritty paste. She turned to the cold tap first. It was a solid, heavy fixture, cast in brass, with a four-pronged handle. It was freezing to the touch. The metal seemed to hold the temperature of the water that flowed through it, radiating a chill that stung her skin. She applied the paste. Rub, rub, rub. The motion was small, circular, and intense. She pressed her finger against the metal, working the grit into the surface. The brown paste turned black as it lifted the oxide from the brass. It was a dirty process, staining the rag and her fingernails, but it was necessary. She worked her way around the base of the tap, digging into the crevices where the metal met the stone sink. She followed the curve of the spout, the arch of the neck. The sound was a soft, friction-filled squeak. Squeak shhh, squeak shhh. It was a microscopic sound, audible only because the rest of the house was so silent. The kitchen beyond the door was quiet now. The cook was resting, the fire was banked, the pots were clean. The scullery was an island of small, repetitive movements. She finished the application of the paste on the cold tap. It looked smeared and dirty, covered in the black residue. She took a clean section of the rag. Now came the polishing. She buffed the metal. The cloth moved faster now, generating a small amount of heat from the friction. As she wiped away the black grime, the gold began to emerge. It was a slow reveal, a dull gleam turning into a bright yellow shine. The brass caught the failing light from the window, reflecting a distorted image of the gray sky and the dark room. It was a small star in the darkness. She moved to the hot tap. It was slightly warmer, though not hot, retaining a faint memory of the boiling water from the boiler. She repeated the process. The dip of the finger, the smear of the paste, the circular rub, the black residue, the clean rag, the buffing. It was a ritual of transformation. Dull to bright, dirty to clean. When the taps were finished, they stood out against the gray stone of the wall, gleaming with a hard, cold perfection. But she was not done with the brass. There was the drain plug, a heavy brass circle attached to a chain. She lifted it from the sink. It was wet and slimy. She dried it. She polished it. The chain links were tedious. She had to rub each one individually, rolling the metal between her thumb and forefinger, feeling the grit of the paste grinding against the brass. Then she turned to the door handles. The handle of the back door, the handle of the pantry door, the handle of the cupboard. Each one was a sphere of dull metal waiting to be revived. She moved through the room, a silent technician of shine. She knelt to polish the brass kick plate on the bottom of the kitchen door. She stood on tiptoes to reach the high latch on the window. Her hands were black with the tarnish. The smell of the ammonia was in her pores. She did not mind. The smell was the smell of work, and the black on her hands was the evidence of the shine on the metal. It was a fair exchange. She finished the last handle. She put the lid back on the tin of paste. She folded the dirty rags and put them back in the box. She washed her hands in the sink, using the cold water and the block of harsh yellow soap. The water turned gray as the polish washed off, swirling down the drain she had just cleaned. She scrubbed her fingernails with the brush, but the black lines remained, indelible marks of her trade. She dried her hands on her apron. The light outside had deepened further. The slate blue was turning to a deep, heavy indigo. The trees in the orchard were losing their definition, merging into a single mass of black shadow. The wind was picking up again, sensing the approach of the night. It rattled the window pane, a loose, shivering sound that echoed in the empty room. She looked at the wooden chopping block on the main table. It was a massive slab of sycamore, thick and scarred by 1,000 knife cuts. It was stained with the juices of the morning's vegetables, the orange of the carrots, the green of the onions. It needed to be whitened. It needed to be purged. She fetched the bag of salt and the half lemon that had been left aside by the cook. This was the bleach of the scullery. She sprinkled the coarse salt over the surface of the wood. The white crystals bounced and scattered, glittering in the gloom like diamond dust. She took the lemon, squeezing it slightly so the juice began to run. She placed the cut side down onto the salted wood. She began to scrub. The lemon was the scourer, the salt was the abrasive. She moved the fruit in wide, sweeping circles. Scrub, grind. Scrub, grind. The salt crunched under the pressure, breaking down into a fine paste as it mixed with the lemon juice. The acid bit into the wood, lifting the stains, bleaching the grain. The smell was sharp and clean, citrus and brine cutting through the lingering scent of the brass polish. It was hard work. The wood was dense and resistant. She had to lean her weight into the table, driving the lemon into the grain. Her shoulder began to ache again, a dull throb that synchronized with the rhythm of her arm. Round and round. The paste turned gray as it absorbed the dirt from the wood. She added more salt. She squeezed more juice. She worked systematically, covering every inch of the block. She scrubbed the edges, where the grease tended to accumulate. She scrubbed the deep knife scars, cleaning out the old food trapped in the fissures. The table was being renewed, stripped of its history, returned to a state of blank potential. When the scrubbing was done, she took a wet cloth and wiped away the salty paste. She rinsed the cloth and wiped again, and again, until the wood was bare and damp. It looked pale, almost white, glowing softly in the dim light. It smelled fresh. It was clean. She stood back. The room was darker now. The corners were lost in shadow. The light from the window was a faint, failing glow that barely reached the center of the room. It was time for the lantern. She walked to the bench where the lantern sat. The glass was cold. She opened the door of the metal cage. She struck a match. The sound was a sharp scritch followed by the flare of sulfur. The yellow flame illuminated her face for a moment, the pale skin, the dark circles under the eyes, the stray hairs escaping the cap. She touched the flame to the candle wick. It caught, wavering for a second before settling into a steady, tear-shaped light. She closed the lantern door. The light pushed the shadows back, creating a warm, golden sphere of visibility in the center of the blue-gray room. It changed the texture of everything. The brick walls looked warmer, rougher. The stone floor looked uneven, full of peaks and valleys. The brass taps she had polished gleamed with a deep, rich fire. She picked up the lantern. The shadows swung around the room, wild and distorted. She carried it to the coal bunker in the corner. The fires in the house would need tending soon. The evening was the time of greatest heat, when the family gathered in the drawing room, when the dinner was cooked. The coal scuttles would need to be full. She opened the door of the bunker. The coal lay in a great, sloping heap, black and glittering. It was a mountain of fossilized forest, cold and hard. She picked up the heavy iron shovel. It scraped against the stone floor. She thrust it into the pile. Crunch! The coal shifted, a landslide of black rocks tumbling down the slope. The sound was loud, harsh, and clattering. She filled the first scuttle. The dust rose in a black cloud, dancing in the beam of the lantern light. She breathed it in, the taste of carbon, of deep earth. She filled the second scuttle, then the third. The work was heavy, demanding the use of her back and legs. She lifted the shovel, balanced the load, and tipped it into the bucket. Clatter, crash. The coal was heavy with potential energy, but here in the scullery, it was just dead weight. It was cold stone that had to be moved. She worked steadily, filling the vessels that would carry the warmth to the upper floors. She was the conduit. She remained cold so that others could be warm. When the scuttles were full, she lined them up by the door. 3 black sentinels waiting for the footmen. She leaned the shovel back against the wall. She dusted her hands on her apron, adding a layer of black soot to the stains of the day. She looked at the window again. It was dark now. The blue had faded to black. The glass was a mirror reflecting the room back at her, the lantern on the floor, the white table, the copper pans on the shelf. The world outside had vanished. There was only the house. The wind was a constant presence now, a voice that spoke in the chimney, a pressure that pushed against the walls. It was a cold, lonely sound. She felt a hollowness in her stomach. It was past the time for the servants' midday meal, which she had eaten quickly, a bowl of stew standing up in the kitchen. Now the hunger was a quiet, dull ache. She walked to the pantry. On a shelf, kept separate from the family's food, was the servants' bread bin. She opened it. She took out a crust of bread, dry and hard. She sat back down on the stool in the corner. She did not light a second candle. The single lantern on the floor was enough. She ate the bread slowly. It was dry, requiring effort to chew. It tasted of flour and yeast, a simple, fundamental taste. She chewed rhythmically, staring at the flame of the candle. This was her moment of stillness. The house was winding up for the evening, but the scullery was in a lull. The vegetables were prepped. The dishes were done. The floor was clean. The brass was polished. The coal was ready. For a few minutes there was no immediate command. She listened to the sounds of the evening beginning. The distant ring of a bell, the drawing room, the footsteps on the stairs, the murmur of voices from the kitchen as the cook began the dinner service, the clatter of a pan. These sounds were the score of her life, the background music to her existence. She finished the bread. She brushed the crumbs from her apron onto the floor. The mice would find them later. She watched the candle flame flicker. A draft was coming from somewhere, perhaps the gap under the back door. The flame danced, casting long, jumping shadows on the wall. The shadows looked like grasping hands, like bending trees, like figures moving in the dark. She felt the cold settling into her bones. The activity of the scrubbing and the shoveling had kept her warm, but now that she was still, the chill of the room was reclaiming her. It started in her feet, in the damp leather of her boots, and traveled up. It was a numbness, a slow freezing of the blood. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wool was rough and scratchy, but it held a faint warmth. She closed her eyes again. She could see the river in her mind, the black water swirling in the hole she had cut, the white ice stretching away into the darkness, the sound of the wind in the reeds. It was waiting for her. Tomorrow she would have to go back. The hole would be frozen. The ice would be thick. The buckets would be heavy. The cycle would repeat. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was still the dinner. The pots to be scrubbed. The plates to be washed. The floor to be mopped again. The night was long and the work was not done. She opened her eyes. She stood up. She picked up the lantern. The metal handle was warm now, heated by the flame. She walked to the sink. She turned on the tap. The water came out with a rush, splashing into the stone basin. It was time to prepare for the next wave. The scullery maid moved to the rack of saucepans. She checked them for dust. She wiped them with a cloth. She was ready. The silence of the afternoon was ending. The noise of the evening was approaching. She stood in the center of the room, a small figure in a gray dress, illuminated by a single candle, waiting for the world to come to her. The wind howled outside, a long, drawn-out note of mourning. It battered the door, demanding entry. But the bolt was drawn. The door was solid. The scullery was a fortress of cold stone and duty, and she was its guardian. She took a breath. The air was cold, tasting of coal dust and lemon. She exhaled, and a wisp of white mist formed in the lantern light, swirling for a moment before vanishing into the shadows. The transition from the waiting silence to the evening labor was not marked by a fanfare, but by the sudden intensification of the heat leaking through the cracks of the green baize door. The kitchen beyond, the engine room of the house, had reached its critical pressure. The great iron range was roaring now, devouring the coal she had hauled, the dampers fully open, the hot plates glowing with a dull, cherry-red malevolence. The scullery, by contrast, remained a cave of cool dampness, a separate ecosystem waiting to receive the waste products of that heat. The scullery maid stood by the sink, her hands hovering over the empty basin, the lantern at her feet casting long, upward shadows that made her face look like a hollow mask. She was ready. The pause was over. The flood was beginning. The door swung open with violence. The kitchen maid, flushed and breathless, backed into the scullery. She carried a massive copper fish kettle, a long, coffin-shaped vessel that radiated heat. She set it down on the wooden draining board with a heavy, reverberating clang. Steam curled from under its lid. The smell of poached salmon, rich, oily, and laced with the scent of bay leaves and vinegar, filled the cold air, overpowering the smell of the damp stone. It was the scent of luxury, thick and cloying. The kitchen maid retreated instantly, disappearing back into the inferno of the kitchen, leaving the scullery maid alone with the vessel. She reached for the kettle. It was still hot, too hot to touch with bare hands. She used the corners of her apron to grip the heavy brass handles. She lifted the lid. A cloud of fish-scented steam billowed up, engulfing her face, moist and warm. Inside, the remains of the court bouillon were a cloudy, greasy pool in which floated the debris of the cooking, limp carrot slices, peppercorns, the skeleton of the fish. It was a ruin. She tipped the kettle over the sink. The liquid poured out, a heavy, pale stream that splashed against the stone, sending up more steam. The smell was intense, filling the small room. The fish bones slid out, catching in the drain guard. She had to pick them out with her fingers, the small, sharp spines prickling her skin. They were warm and slippery. She threw them into the slop bucket. Plip, plip. The bucket was becoming a stratigraphy of the day's meals, porridge, vegetable pairings, lunch scraps, and now the dinner waste. She turned on the hot tap. The water hammered into the kettle, drumming against the copper bottom. She added a handful of soda. The white crystals hissed as they hit the hot metal. She grabbed the scrubbing brush. The cleaning began. It was a battle against the oil. The fish fat had coated the inside of the kettle in a stubborn, translucent film. She scrubbed in long, sweeping strokes, driving the bristles into the corners where the copper was joined. The steam rose around her, turning the scullery into a misty, yellow-lit purgatory. The condensation began to form on the walls again. The bricks, cold from the winter air outside, wept with the moisture. Rivulets of water ran down the masonry, collecting in the crevices of the mortar, dripping onto the floor. The window was completely obscured now, a sheet of gray fog. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the steam, the lantern light, and the smell of fish and soda. As she finished the kettle, the door opened again. More vessels arrived. A stack of vegetable terrines, their lids askew, revealing the dried remains of white sauce. A gravy boat, the brown liquid congealed into a skin on the surface. The plates from the first course. The pace was relentless. There was no time to dry, only to wash. She stacked the clean, wet copper on the rack and turned immediately to the china. The sink water turned gray and greasy within minutes. She pulled the plug, listening to the heavy gurgle of the drain swallowing the filth. She refilled it, hot water, soda, soap. The routine was a trance. Her hands moved of their own accord, red and wrinkled, insensitive to the scalding temperature. They were tools, disconnected from her mind. Her mind had retreated to a small, quiet place deep inside, a place where the noise of the water and the clatter of the plates were distant echoes. She washed the delicate soup bowls. They were rimmed with gold, fragile things that felt light as eggshells in her heavy, wet hands. She treated them with a terrified reverence. Dip, wipe, rinse. The gold flashed in the lantern light. These bowls had just left the dining room where they had been held by soft hands, where the spoon had scraped gently against the porcelain. Now they were here in the dark, being purged of their purpose. Then came the roasting pans. This was the heavy artillery of the kitchen. The kitchen maid dragged them in, unable to lift them. They were black iron, vast and crusted with the burnt remnants of the roast beef. They were coated in solidified dripping, hard white fat that looked like wax. They smelled of scorched meat and iron. The scullery maid looked at them. They required a different approach. The sponge would be useless here. She reached for the chainmail scrubber, a square of linked iron rings. She reached for the scraping knife. She hoisted the first pan into the sink. It occupied the entire basin, blocking the light. She turned on the hot tap. The water hit the cold fat, but it did not melt it immediately. She had to chip away at it. She used the knife, scraping the bottom of the pan. Scritch, scrape, scritch, scrape. The sound was harsh, setting her teeth on edge. Ribbons of white fat curled up from the iron. She gathered them and threw them into the fat bin. This was saved to be rendered down for soap or candles. Nothing was lost. Once the bulk of the fat was removed, she attacked the burnt residue. She sprinkled coarse salt and sand into the pan. She took the chainmail cloth. She scrubbed. It was brutal work. She had to use her whole upper body, leaning her weight onto the iron mesh, grinding it against the pan. The friction created heat. The black burnt crust dissolved slowly, turning the water into a dark, muddy sludge. Her arms burned. The muscles in her shoulders, already tired from the morning's water carrying, screamed in protest. She ignored them. Pain was just information, and she had no use for it. She scrubbed until the iron was smooth, until her fingers found no purchase on the surface. She rinsed the pan with boiling water. It steamed, drying almost instantly from its own heat. It looked black, dead, and clean. She lifted it out. It was heavy, a dead weight that pulled at her spine. She set it on the floor. There was no room on the draining board. The floor was becoming a parking lot for the ironware. The next pan was the same, and the next. The repetition was crushing. There was no variation, only the endless sequence of dirty objects becoming clean objects. The steam in the room grew thicker. The lantern light was diffused into a golden fog that swirled with every movement she made. She felt like she was underwater, moving through a heavy, resistant medium. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wet wrist. Sweat was running down into her eyes, stinging with the salt. Her cap was limp with the dampness. Her dress stuck to her back, but her feet were freezing. The cold from the stone floor penetrated the soles of her boots, a sharp contrast to the humidity of the air. Her toes were numb blocks of ice, while her face burned. The bell rang, the dining room again. The main course was cleared. The dessert was being served. This meant the next wave was imminent. The dinner plates, the silver platters, the vegetable dishes. She drained the sink again. The water was black as ink. She shoveled the debris from the drain guard, soggy bits of beef, burnt onions, gray sludge. She threw it in the bucket. She scrubbed the sink itself, removing the ring of grease that had formed at the water line. It had to be cleaned to receive the next load. The door opened. The footman entered this time, carrying a tray that seemed to float in the steam. He looked like a ghost, his livery dark, his face pale. He set the tray down without a word and vanished. The plates were piled high. They were smeared with gravy, mustard, and horseradish. The smell was sharp and vinegary. The silver forks were tangled in the mess. She began to sort, silver to the jug, china to the stack, scraps to the bucket. The washing resumed. The rhythm accelerated. The kitchen was pushing hard now to finish the service. The pressure came down the line, ending here at the sink. She washed faster, swirl, rinse. Rack, swirl, rinse, rack. She was a machine. She did not think. She did not feel. She only washed. She washed a silver meat platter. It was huge, heavy, and slippery with grease. She had to hold it with both hands, balancing it in the water. The intricate engraving around the rim was filled with white fat. She had to use a small brush to clean it out, poking the bristles into the silver leaves and vines. It was tedious, microscopic work in the middle of the heavy labor. She washed the sauce boats. She washed the salt cellars. She washed the mustard pots. Each object had its own shape, its own demands, its own way of holding onto the dirt. She knew them all. She knew the chip on the rim of the vegetable dish. She knew the loose handle on the gravy ladle. They were her intimates, her silent companions. The steam began to condense on the ceiling now. Heavy drops of water formed on the plaster, hanging for a moment before falling. Drip. One landed on her neck, cold and startling. She flinched but did not stop. Drip. Another on the draining board. The room was weeping. Outside, the wind had changed its voice. It was no longer a moan, but a high-pitched shriek as it tore around the corners of the house. It battered the window, rattling the frame so hard she thought the glass might shatter. The draft from the door was stronger, cutting through the steam like a knife. It swirled around her ankles, a current of freezing air that battled the heat of the sink. She was caught between the elements, fire and ice, steam and frost. She was the bridge between them, the place where they met and neutralized each other. Finally, the dessert dishes arrived. These were different, sticky with sugar stained with fruit juice. Plates smeared with cream and crumbs of pastry, crystal bowls with the remains of trifle. The smell changed from savory to sweet, vanilla, sherry, raspberry. It was a sickly, heavy scent in the hot air. She washed the crystal with extreme care. The hot water could crack it if it was too cold. She tempered the glass, dipping it slowly. The sugar dissolved instantly, leaving the water clear but syrupy. She rinsed them in warm water and set them on the linen. They sparkled even in the gloom, refracting the lantern light into tiny rainbows. Then the coffee cups, small, delicate things, the saucers, the silver spoons, the end of the meal. The family was moving to the drawing room now. The eating was done, but the cleaning was not. The kitchen maid brought in the final load from the kitchen itself. The pots used for the sauces, the whisks, the sieves, the baking sheets. It was a mountain of metal. The scullery maid looked at it with a dull acceptance. There was no despair because despair required hope and she had none. There was only the work. She washed the sieves. The wire mesh was clogged with puree. She had to bang them against the side of the sink to dislodge the food, then pick out the stubborn bits with a pin. It was slow, frustrating work. Her eyes strained in the dim light to see the mesh. She washed the baking sheets. They were large, flat, and awkward. They splashed water onto the floor when she tried to rinse them. Her apron was soaked through now. The water had reached her skin, cold and clammy against her stomach. Her dress was heavy with moisture. She washed the last whisk. She washed the last spoon. She drained the sink for the last time. The sound of the water departing was like a heavy sigh. The bottom of the sink was stained and gray. She scrubbed it out. She polished the taps again, removing the splash marks. She stood back. The draining board was a forest of drying china and metal. The rack was full. The floor was covered in iron pans. The room was chaotic with clean objects. Now came the drying. It had to be done immediately, before the rust set in on the iron, before the water spots dried on the silver. She took a stack of fresh tea towels. She began to wipe. She dried the silver first. It was warm from the water. She rubbed it until it shone, her reflection distorted and ghostly in the metal. She placed the forks and spoons in the velvet-lined box brought by the footman. Every piece had its slot. Order was being imposed on the chaos. She dried the china, plate by plate. She checked each one. No smears, no grease. She stacked them. The piles grew tall, precarious towers of white ceramic. She dried the iron pans. This was critical. If they were left damp, they would rust within the hour. She dried them with a rough cloth. Then she took a piece of paper dipped in oil and wiped the inside of each pan. This sealed the iron, protecting it from the air. The smell of the oil was heavy and industrial. She dried the copper. She polished it as she dried, giving it a final buff. The fish kettle, the saucepans, the molds, they glowed like embers in the dark room. The process took an hour, maybe two. Time was elastic in the scullery. It stretched and compressed, measured only by the height of the stacks and the ache in her back. The steam slowly dissipated, leaving the air damp and cold again. The condensation on the walls stopped running, freezing into a thin sheen of ice in the corners. When the last pan was dried and put away, she looked around. The room was silent again. The storm had passed. The wreckage had been cleared. The scullery was returned to its state of waiting. She felt the exhaustion now as a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, pulling her eyelids down. Her hands were throbbing, the skin white and sodden, the knuckles raw. Her back was a rigid knot of pain. She wanted to lie down, to close her eyes, to sleep, but she could not. Not yet. The floor was a mess. It was wet, covered in puddles of greasy water, trampled with footprints, littered with crumbs and scraps that had missed the bucket. It had to be cleaned. It had to be perfect for the morning. She went to the bucket. She filled it with the last of the hot water from the boiler. The boiler was nearly empty now. The tap sputtered and spat steam before delivering the water. She added the soft soap. She took the scrubbing brush. She knelt. The wet stone soaked through her petticoats instantly. She did not care. She was already wet. She began to scrub shhh, scrub shhh. She moved backwards across the room, erasing the footprints of the evening. She scrubbed away the grease spots. She scrubbed away the dried sauce. She worked in the shadow of the table under the sink by the door. She was thorough. She knew every flagstone, every crack, every uneven edge. She washed the floor as if it were an altar with a grim, silent devotion. She reached the door. She wrung out the cloth. The water in the bucket was black. She poured it down the drain. She rinsed the bucket. She rinsed the brush. She stood up. She was trembling. The energy that had sustained her through the rush was gone, leaving only the cold and the fatigue. She looked at the room. It was clean. It was dark. It was cold. She walked to the lantern. The candle was burning low again, a stub of wax in a pool of liquid. She picked it up. She needed to check the doors. She needed to check the fires. The house was settling down for the night, but her watch was not over. She walked into the kitchen. The range was banked up, the fire covered with a layer of damp coal dust to keep it smoldering through the night. The room was warm, smelling of the lingering dinner and the drying laundry that hung on the rack above the stove. The cook was gone. The kitchen maid was gone. The room was empty. She checked the back door. The bolt was shot. The iron was cold. She checked the window latches, secure. She walked through the dark passages, her footsteps silent on the stone. The house above was quiet. The family had gone up to bed. The lights were extinguished. She returned to the scullery. There was one last task, the personal task. She had to clean herself. She could not go to her bed covered in the grease and filth of the day. She poured a small amount of water into a basin. It was lukewarm, the dregs of the boiler. She took a piece of soap. She stripped off her apron. It was heavy, stiff with dirt and water. She hung it on the peg. She unbuttoned her sleeves. She washed her face. The water felt gray and hard. She scrubbed her neck, her arms. She tried to scrub the black from her hands, but it was too deep. It was part of her skin now. She dried herself with a rough towel. The friction was the only warmth she felt. She put on her shawl. She picked up the lantern. She looked around the scullery one last time. The brass taps gleamed in the dying light. The floor shone dully. The copper pans were sleeping eyes watching her. It was done. She blew out the candle in the lantern. The darkness rushed in instantly, absolute and heavy. It filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth. It was a physical substance. She opened the door to the back stairs. She began to climb. Up, out of the stone depths, out of the damp, towards the attic, towards the frost. The stairs creaked under her boots. Creak, creak. The sound was loud in the silence. She held the banister, pulling herself up. Her legs were lead. She reached the top corridor. It was freezing here. The air was thin and sharp. She walked to her door. She opened it. The room was exactly as she had left it 18 hours ago. The bed was a dark shape. The window was a square of ice. The smell was the same, dust and cold wood. She walked to the window. She looked out. The moon had risen. It was full and bright, hanging in a clear patch of sky. Its light reflected off the frost on the glass, creating a glittering, silver landscape. Through the clear patch she had melted in the morning, she could see the world below. The garden was a study in black and white. The trees were ink drawings on snow. And far down in the valley, a silver ribbon wound through the darkness. The river. It looked peaceful from here, silent, still. A band of light in the dark earth, but she knew the truth of it. She knew the weight of it. She knew the thickness of the ice and the cold of the water. She shivered, a violent, racking shudder that shook her whole frame. The cold was inside her now. It was in the marrow of her bones. She turned away from the window. She sat on the edge of the bed. She began to unlace her boots. Her fingers were so stiff she could barely work the knots. She picked at the twine, her breath clouding in the moonlight. One boot off. It fell to the floor with a thud. She rubbed her foot. The wool stocking was damp. She peeled it off. Her skin was white, waxy, and cold as marble. The second boot, the second stocking. She stood up to unbutton her dress. Her fingers fumbled with the bone buttons. 1, 2, 3. The dress fell to the floor, a heavy gray ring. She stepped out of it. She was in her shift. It was thin, offering no protection against the air of the attic. She shivered again. She moved quickly now, driven by the desperate need for warmth. She pulled back the covers of the bed. The sheets were freezing. They felt like sheets of ice. She climbed in. She pulled the heavy wool blankets up to her chin. She curled into a tight ball, knees to chest, trying to preserve the tiny spark of heat in her core. She lay there shaking. The bed did not warm up. The cold of the room pressed down on the blankets, a heavy hand holding her down. She could hear the wind on the roof. Whoosh, whoosh. It was the breath of the winter breathing over the house. She closed her eyes. She waited for the shivering to stop. She waited for the sleep to come. But her mind was still in the scullery. She could still feel the weight of the buckets. She could still hear the scrape of the knife. She could still smell the onions and the soda. The images played behind her eyelids. The orange carrots, the black coal, the white steam, the gray water. They cycled round and round, a carousel of labor. She tried to push them away. She tried to think of nothing. She tried to become like the house, stone and wood, unfeeling and enduring. She listened to the silence. It was different up here. It was a thin, high silence stretched tight over the roof. Down below the scullery was a deep, heavy silence, but here it was brittle. She lay in the dark. The moon moved across the window, shifting the square of light across the floorboards. It touched the washstand. It touched the chair. It touched the heap of gray clothes. She was the scullery maid. She was the breaker of the ice. She was the carrier of the coal. She was the washer of the plates, and she was alone. But the story was not over. The night was not empty. As she lay there, drifting on the edge of exhaustion, a sound reached her ears. A sound from outside. Not the wind, not the trees. A sound from the river. A sharp cracking sound, like a gunshot in the valley. The ice was shifting. The river was moving. She opened her eyes. She stared at the dark ceiling. The river was calling. The sound of the river ice cracking did not repeat. It was a singular event, a solitary report from the valley floor that hung in the freezing atmosphere of the attic for a long time, vibrating against the eardrums of the scullery maid. She lay perfectly still beneath the heavy wool blankets, her eyes wide open, staring into the canopy of shadows above her bed. The crack had been loud, sharp, and violent, the sound of tension being released, of a massive, frozen tectonic plate shifting under the pressure of the expanding cold. It was a reminder that the world outside was not dead, merely suspended in a state of high-stress hibernation. The river was fighting against its own freezing, a slow, geological battle of water against ice, current against crystal. The silence that followed was deeper than before. It was a thick, accumulated silence that filled the corners of the room like drifted snow. The maid pulled the blanket higher, tucking the rough edge over her ear, trying to muffle the memory of the sound. But the image was already there, etched in her mind's eye with the precision of a charcoal drawing. She could see the black, jagged line running through the white surface of the river. She could see the dark water welling up, seizing the air and freezing instantly into a new scar. She could see the spot where she would have to stand in a few hours, the very spot that had just groaned and shifted. She shifted her legs beneath the covers. The bed was beginning to warm up, a very small, very localized miracle of physics. Her body heat, trapped by the density of the wool and the straw mattress, had created a thin envelope of tepid air. It was the only warmth she possessed, a resource she had generated from her own blood and breath. Outside of this cocoon, the room was aggressively cold. The air in the attic was dropping in temperature as the night deepened towards the nadir. She could feel the cold pressing down on the blanket, a physical weight, trying to crush the pocket of warmth she had made. Her breath rose in a steady, rhythmic plume. In the moonlight that slanted through the window, the vapor was visible, a translucent white ghost that escaped from her lips, drifted upward and dissolved into the darkness of the rafters. She watched it. Inhale. The chest rises. The air enters cold and sharp. Exhale. The chest falls. The mist appears. It was a slow, hypnotic cycle, the only movement in the room. It was proof of life in a frozen landscape. The moonlight on the floorboards was stark and beautiful. It was not the soft, yellow light of the lantern or the warm, orange glow of the kitchen fire. It was a blue-white light, hard and unforgiving. It cast shadows that were absolute black, with no graduation of tone. The leg of the washstand cast a long, thin shadow that stretched across the room like the hand of a clock. The pile of her clothes on the chair was a sculptured mass of gray and black, a frozen mountain range in miniature. The light revealed the grain of the wood floor, the dust in the cracks, the worn patches where her boots had stepped morning after morning. She closed her eyes again, but sleep was a distant shore. Her body was tired, exhausted in fact, but her muscles were still humming with the memory of the labor. It was a phantom sensation, a lingering echo of the weight she had carried. Her hands, curled against her chest, still felt the bite of the wire handles. Her shoulders still felt the drag of the water. Her knees still felt the hardness of the stone floor. The work had imprinted itself onto her anatomy. She was shaped by the task she performed. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she did not see dreams of summer meadows or warm hearths. She saw the scullery. She saw the endless stream of dirty plates. She saw the mountain of coal. The images cycled through her mind, a repetitive, monochromatic film loop. The flash of the knife on the carrot, the swirl of the gray water in the sink, the gleam of the copper. It was a mental inventory of her existence. She could not escape it. The house owned her waking hours, and it encroached upon her sleeping ones. She tried to guide her mind away. She tried to think of the river not as a task, but as a place. She let herself drift down the hill, past the orchard, past the garden wall, down to the valley floor. In her imagination, she walked onto the jetty. The wind was gone. The air was still. The moon was high. She stepped off the jetty and onto the ice. It held her. She walked out into the center of the river. The ice was clear as glass, a thick lens over the abyss. She looked down. Beneath her feet, beneath the suspended bubbles and the trapped weeds, the water was moving. It was a slow, dark current sliding silently towards the sea. It was a world of absolute secrecy. She imagined she could sink through the ice, not breaking it but passing through it like a ghost. She descended into the water. It was not cold in this dream state, it was just heavy. A medium that supported her, held her, suspended her. She floated in the dark current, weightless. The buckets were gone. The heavy boots were gone. The wool dress was gone. She was just a consciousness drifting in the flow. Around her, the river was alive with a slow, torpid life. She saw the fish, suspended in the gloom, their gills moving slowly, their eyes open and unblinking. They were waiting for the spring. They hung in the water like ornaments, silver and gray in the filtered moonlight that penetrated the ice. She saw the water weeds, long green ribbons waving gently in the current, combing the water. She saw the stones on the riverbed, smooth and round, worn down by eons of water. It was a peaceful place, a place of no demands. The river did not ask for coal. The river did not need its floor scrubbed. The river simply was. It flowed, it froze, it melted, it flowed again. It was indifferent to the human world above. She found comfort in this indifference. To be small, to be part of the flow, to be carried along without effort, this was the ultimate rest. She drifted past the roots of the great willows that lined the banks. The roots were gnarled tangles of wood, reaching down into the water, drinking the cold. They looked like the fingers of the earth, grasping the river. She drifted past the sunken log, the skeleton of the tree she had seen from the bank. Up close, it was covered in algae, a fuzzy green coat that softened its sharp edges. It was a home for snails and beetles, a castle in the deep. The current carried her on, downstream, away from the house, away from the hill, away from the smoke and the bells. She floated towards the sea, towards the vast, open horizon where the river ended and the ocean began. It was a journey of silence. The only sound was the muffled, rhythmic thrumming of the water itself, a sound like a giant heart beating very slowly. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Above her, the ice sheet was a ceiling of white marble, veined with cracks and flaws. It filtered the moonlight, turning it into a pale, shifting luminescence that danced on the riverbed. It was a cathedral of cold, vast and quiet. But the dream could not last. The anchor of the house was too heavy. It pulled her back. The sensation of weightlessness began to fade. The heavy wool blankets pressed down on her again. The straw mattress dug into her hip. The cold air of the attic bit at her nose. She opened her eyes. The room had changed. The moon had moved. The shadow of the washstand had shifted to the right, lengthening and distorting. The light on the floor was dimmer now, the moon passing behind a thicker bank of clouds or descending behind the roofline. The room was sinking back into the deep charcoal gray of the early morning hours. She listened to the house. It was making its own night noises. The great structure was cooling down. The fires in the lower rooms had died down to embers hours ago. The heat was leaking out through the windows, through the roof, through the stone walls. As the temperature dropped, the materials of the house contracted. Somewhere in the wall, a timber groaned, a low wooden complaint of stress, creak. It was the sound of an old ship settling in the water. Then a sharp crack from the floorboards in the corridor, the wood shrinking in the dry cold. The iron water pipes clanked softly, a distant metallic echo as the pressure changed. The house was alive, reacting to the winter just as the river did. It was a living skin that protected them, but it suffered for it. She felt a kinship with the house. It too was frozen. It too was enduring. It stood on the hill, exposed to the wind, taking the brunt of the weather so that the people inside could sleep. She was part of its structure, as essential as the beams or the slate tiles. She was the biological component that kept the mechanical systems running. She turned onto her other side. The movement released a puff of warm air from under the covers, which was immediately consumed by the cold room. She tucked her hands between her knees for warmth. Her feet were still cold, 2 blocks of ice at the bottom of the bed. They would not be warm until summer. She stared at the window. The frost was growing. She could see it happening, or she imagined she could. The white crystalline ferns were creeping across the glass, inch by inch, sealing the room off from the world. The clear patch she had made yesterday was gone, healed over by the night. The window was now a solid pane of white ice, glowing faintly with the exterior light. It was beautiful, intricate, and deadly. It was a barrier of art. She wondered what time it was. There was no clock in the attic. The servants did not need clocks. They were woken by the bell or by habit. But she knew the rhythm of the night. She could feel the weight of the hours. It felt like 3:00 a.m., the dead hour, the time when the human spirit is at its lowest, when the darkness seems eternal, when the sun seems like a myth that will never return. In this hour, the cold was a presence. It sat in the chair. It stood by the door. It lay on top of the blanket. It was patient. It knew that eventually the fire would go out completely. It knew that eventually the flesh would cool. It was the natural state of the universe, and warmth was just a temporary aberration. She thought of the coal in the cellar, tons of it, black sunlight stored in rock. It was her ally in the war against the cold. Tomorrow she would have to move more of it. The thought made her weary, a deep, bone-heavy fatigue, but it also gave her a sense of purpose. She was the keeper of the fire. Without her, the house would die. The family would freeze. The pipes would burst. The order would collapse. There was a strange dignity in that thought. It was a gray, hard dignity, like the stone of the sink, but it was real. She was necessary. She lay there, suspended between the 2 poles of her existence, the warmth of the bed and the cold of the room, the rest of the night and the labor of the day. She was in the bardo of the scullery maid, a liminal space where time stood still. A mouse scratched behind the wainscoting, scritch, scratch, scritch. It was a tiny sound, busy and frantic. The mouse was awake, foraging, building a nest, surviving. It was another inhabitant of the dark, another small life fighting the winter. She felt no animosity towards it. They were both gleaners, living on the margins of the great house. The wind outside picked up again. It buffeted the roof tiles, a heavy, dull thudding. It whistled through the eaves, a high, lonely note. It was searching for a gap, a crack, a way in. It wanted to fill the attic with snow. It wanted to turn the room into an ice cave, but the roof held. The slates were tight. The house stood firm. She watched the shadows on the ceiling. They seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the wind. They were like dark clouds drifting across a gray sky. She traced shapes in them, a face, a hand, a bucket, a shovel. The tools of her trade were everywhere, even in the shadows. She felt the thirst then, a dry, scratchy feeling in her throat. The air in the attic was incredibly dry. The frost had sucked all the moisture out of it. She thought of the water pitcher on the washstand, but she knew it would be frozen. A lid of ice would be covering the water. To drink, she would have to get up, break the ice, and drink the freezing liquid. It would chill her to the core. It wasn't worth the loss of heat. She swallowed, trying to wet her throat. She would wait for the morning tea. The weak, bitter tea that tasted like heaven. The anticipation of that tea became a focal point, a small, glowing ember of hope in the future. She visualized the mug, the steam rising, the heat in her hands, the liquid going down. It was hours away, but it was coming. The sun would rise, the fire would be lit, the tea would be brewed. This certainty was her anchor. The cycle was relentless, yes, but it was also reliable. It did not deviate. It did not lie. It promised nothing but repetition, and it delivered exactly that. In a chaotic world, there was peace in that absolute predictability. She began to drift again. The waking mind was losing its grip. The heavy sleep of the early morning was pulling her down. The shadows on the ceiling blurred. The sound of the wind became a steady white noise, like the sound of the sea. She was back on the river, but this time she was not under the ice. She was standing on the bank watching the dawn. The sky was turning a pale, translucent violet. The trees were frosted white. The river was a band of silver mist. And in the center of the ice, the hole she had made was still open, a black pupil in a white eye. Steam was rising from the hole, a column of white vapor ascending straight up into the still air. It looked like a geyser, like a breath from the earth. She walked towards it. The snow crunched under her boots. Crunch, crunch. The sound was crisp and loud. She reached the edge of the hole. She looked down. The water was not black anymore. It was glowing with a faint inner light, a deep, impossible blue. It called to her, not to jump in, but to understand, to see the depth, to acknowledge the power. She knelt by the hole. She dipped her hand in. The water was warm. This was the lie of the dream, the seduction of sleep, the mind creating what the body craved, warm water in the river, a gentle winter, a soft world. She let herself believe it. For this 1 hour before the bell rang, before the reality returned, she let herself exist in a world where the river was warm and the buckets were light. The attic room remained silent. The moon finally set, leaving the room in total darkness. The frost on the window stopped growing, having covered every inch of glass. The temperature reached its lowest point. The world was locked in the absolute zero of the night. Inside the bed, the maid slept. Her breathing was slow and deep. Inhale, exhale. The mist from her lips continued to rise in the dark, invisible now, but still there, a silent prayer of survival. She slept the sleep of the stone, heavy, dense, dreamless now. She was recharging. She was gathering the strength to break the ice again. Outside in the valley, the river shifted again. Another crack, louder this time, closer. The ice was thickening. The winter was tightening its grip. The scullery maid slept on, drifting towards the dawn, drifting towards the bell, drifting towards the inevitable return of the cold. The summons came from the darkness, a sharp, metallic intrusion that shattered the heavy architecture of sleep. It was the bell, not the polite, distant tinkle of the drawing-room bell, nor the grand, echoing clangor of the front door bell, but the harsh, rattling agitation of the servant's alarm. It was a mechanical rooster, made of brass and wire, mounted on a spring in the corridor outside the attic rooms. It jerked into life, the metal clapper striking the rim with a frantic, vibrating urgency that seemed to drill directly into the center of the skull. Clang-jangle, clang-jangle. The sound was violent, discordant, and absolute. It did not ask, it commanded. It announced that the grace period of the night was over and the contract of labor was back in force. The scullery maid opened her eyes. The transition was instant. One moment she was floating in the warm, impossible water of the dream river, and the next she was lying in the crushing dark of the attic, the sound of the bell decaying into a dying tremor of the spring. The silence that rushed back into the room was aggressive, colder and harder than the silence of the night. It was the silence of expectation. The house was waiting. She lay still for 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. It was a tiny rebellion, a momentary refusal to acknowledge the physics of the morning. The bed was warm. It was a sanctuary of body heat, a burrow lined with the smell of wool and sleep. To leave it was to enter a hostile environment. The air in the room was freezing, colder, she sensed, than it had been when she went to bed. The temperature had bottomed out in the pre-dawn hour, settling into a deep, penetrating frost that snapped the timber and thickened the blood. She pushed the blankets down. The cold hit her like a physical blow, a wall of ice water washing over her skin. It was a shock that never lessened, no matter how many thousands of mornings she had endured it. It made her gasp, a sharp intake of freezing air that stung her throat. She sat up, the straw mattress rustling loudly, the sound dry and brittle like dead leaves. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet sought the floorboards. They found them, and the contact was an electric shock of cold. The wood felt less like timber and more like a sheet of frozen iron. There was no light. The moon had set long ago. The window was a rectangle of absolute black, distinguished from the walls only by the faint, ghostly luminescence of the thick frost that coated the glass. It offered no illumination, only a sense of boundary. She was blind in the room, forced to navigate by the spatial memory of her muscles. She reached out into the void. Her hand brushed the rough wood of the chair back. She found the box of matches. She slid the drawer open. The match felt thin and fragile in her numb fingers. She struck it against the side of the box. Scritch. The sound was loud. A spark flew, died, then a second strike brought the flare. The sulfur bloomed, a pungent yellow flower in the dark. She held it to the candle stump. The wick was black and curled, reluctant to catch. It smoked for a moment. Then a small blue flame attached itself, growing slowly into a tear-shaped yellow light. The room revealed itself. It was exactly as it had been, but the shadows seemed longer, sharper. The frost on the window was thicker, an intricate, opaque jungle of ice ferns that had grown wild during the night. The water in the pitcher on the washstand was frozen solid. She could see the hump of the ice rising above the rim, cracked in the center where the pressure had released. She stood up. The air was so cold it felt thin, insufficient to fill the lungs. She began to dress. It was the reverse of the night's ritual, but harder because the clothes were cold. She picked up her shift. It was stiff, the fabric holding the shape of the chair it had lain on. She pulled it over her head. The cold linen touched her skin, and she shuddered, a violent, involuntary spasm that shook her frame. She reached for the stockings. They were like tubes of ice. She rolled them on, the wool scratching against her goose-fleshed legs. She tied the garters, her fingers clumsy and stiff. Then the dress, the heavy gray wool. It smelled of the previous day, of coal smoke, of onions, of damp stone. It was a garment of memory holding the history of her labor in its fibers. She pulled it on, the weight of it settling on her shoulders like a familiar yoke. She buttoned the bodice. The bone buttons were freezing cold discs. 1, 2, 3. The repetition was soothing in its mindless necessity. She sat to put on her boots. The leather had stiffened in the cold air. It was hard and unyielding. She had to force her feet inside, pushing against the resistance of the cured hide. She pulled the laces tight. The twine cut into her fingers. She tied the knots. She stood up and stamped her feet, the hobnails ringing dully on the wood. Thud, thud. It was the sound of the day beginning. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She picked up the candle, shielding the flame with her cupped hand. She opened the door. The corridor was a tunnel of drafty darkness. The air here was moving, flowing like a cold river from the cracks in the roof down towards the lower floors. She walked to the stairs. The descent began, step by step. The candle cast a moving circle of light that illuminated her boots and the edge of the stairs, leaving the rest in shadow. The banister was cold under her hand. The house was silent, but it was a different silence from the night. It was a tense silence. The house knew the servants were moving. It was waiting for the blood to start pumping through its veins. She reached the green baize door at the bottom of the stairs. She pushed it open. It swung silently, admitting her to the service wing. The smell changed instantly. The dry, dusty cold of the upper house was replaced by the damp, stone-scented cold of the basement level. It smelled of coal dust, stale cooking fat, and the faint, underlying odor of drains. She entered the kitchen. It was a cavern of shadows. The great range was dead. The fire she had banked the night before had burned itself out, leaving only a bed of gray ash and a few dark, unburnt coals. The iron of the stove was cold to the touch. The room felt lifeless, abandoned. The copper pans on the wall were dull, reflecting no light. The long wooden table was a pale island in the gloom. She did not stop. She walked through to the scullery. This was the heart of the morning's cold. The scullery was built of stone and brick, with no insulation. It held the temperature of the earth. The air here was visibly colder. Her breath plumed out in thick white clouds that swirled in the candle flame. She set the candle on the bench. She looked at the sink. The brass taps she had polished were dull again, coated in a fine layer of condensation that had frozen into a rime of frost. The bucket of water she had left filled, the one she had hauled from the river, had a skin of ice on it. It was thin, transparent ice, but it was there. The cold had reclaimed its territory. The first task was the fire. Without fire, there was no water. Without water, there was no cleaning. Without cleaning, the house could not function. She picked up the coal scuttle and the ash bucket. She walked back into the kitchen. She knelt before the range. The stone flags were freezing, biting through her layers of petticoats. She opened the firebox door. A puff of fine gray ash drifted out, settling on her apron. The grate was choked with the residue of yesterday's heat. Gray powder, clinkers, fused lumps of impurities that looked like volcanic rock and unburnt shale. She took the heavy iron poker. She thrust it into the bars of the grate. She riddled the ash, clank, crackle, clank. The sound was loud and harsh in the quiet kitchen. The ash fell through the bars into the pan below with a soft, rushing sound like dry rain. Dust billowed up, a gray fog that tasted of sulfur and dead fire. She coughed, a dry, hacking sound, turning her head away, but the dust was everywhere. It coated her hands, her face, the floor. She pulled out the ash pan. It was heavy with the dense waste. She tipped it into the ash bucket. The dust rose again, swirling in the draft from the chimney. She scraped the grate clean, using the small shovel to dig out the clinkers that had fused to the iron bars. They required force to dislodge. Scrape, chip, scrape. It was a battle against the stubborn remains of the combustion. When the grate was empty, it looked like a dark, cold mouth. She had to fill it. She had to create life from nothing. She reached for the newspaper. She crumpled the sheets into loose balls. The paper was dry and brittle, crackling loudly. She stuffed them into the bottom of the grate. She arranged the kindling wood on top, thin sticks of pine that smelled of resin. She built a structure, a lattice of wood that would allow the air to flow. It was an engineering task. If the wood was too tight, the fire would smother. If it was too loose, the flame would not catch. She reached for the coal scuttle. She selected the smaller lumps, the ones the size of a fist. She placed them carefully on the wood, balancing them so they wouldn't crush the paper. Her hands were black now, covered in soot and coal dust. The black stained the cuticles, the lines of the palms. It was a permanent tattoo of her trade. Struck a match. The flare of light illuminated the inside of the range, revealing the soot-caked flues at the back. She touched the flame to the paper. It caught instantly. The yellow fire licked up, curling around the wood. The pine began to snap and pop. Smoke curled up the chimney. She watched it for a moment, ensuring the draw was good. The flame turned from yellow to orange as the wood caught. The first heat of the day began to radiate from the bars. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. A promise. She closed the firebox door. She adjusted the dampers, sliding the iron plates to control the airflow. Clang. Slide. She knew the instrument of the range perfectly. She played it like an organ, tuning the air and the fire to produce the maximum heat. She stood up. Her knees cracked. She picked up the ash bucket. It was full of gray dust. It had to be emptied outside. She walked back to the scullery. She picked up the lantern. She went to the back door. She unbolted it. The bolt was stiff with cold, groaning as she slid it back. She opened the door. The morning air rushed in. It was still dark outside, pitch black. The wind had died down slightly, but the cold was intense. It was a still, heavy cold that froze the nose hairs instantly. Snow had fallen during the night. A thin dusting of fresh white powder covered the cobblestones of the yard, smoothing out the roughness, hiding the ice. She stepped out. The snow crunched under her boots. Crunch, crunch. It was a dry, powdery sound. She walked to the ash pit, a designated area behind the coal shed. She tipped the bucket. The gray ash poured out onto the snow, a dirty stain spreading on the white. The dust hung in the still air, a gray ghost cloud. She turned back to the house. The kitchen window was glowing faintly orange now, the fire beginning to take hold. It was a small beacon in the vast darkness. She returned to the scullery. She bolted the door. She washed her hands in the cold tap water to remove the worst of the soot. The water was agonizingly cold, making her fingers ache deep in the joints. She dried them on a rough towel. Now the kettle. She picked up the great iron kettle. It was empty. She took the bucket of water she had fetched yesterday, the one with the ice skin. She broke the ice with her knuckles. Crack. The shards bobbed in the dark water. She poured the freezing water into the kettle, glug, glug, glug. She carried the kettle to the range. She swung the heavy iron arm out, hung the kettle on the hook, and swung it back over the hot plate. The iron clanged against the stove top. The cycle was engaged, the fire was lit, the water was heating. She returned to the scullery. The sink was waiting. The floor needed sweeping again. The footman's boots from the night before had left mud, which had dried into gray dust. She picked up the broom. She began to sweep, swish, swish. The rhythm returned. It was the metronome of her life. The bristles scraped against the stone. She swept the dust into a pile. She swept the corners. She swept under the sink. The light in the room was changing. The darkness was turning to a deep, bruising blue. The dawn was approaching. It was not a sunrise, but a slow lightening of the gray sky, a gradual revelation of the frozen world. The frost on the window began to glow with a cold, pale light. She heard the sound of the house waking up above, the floorboards creaking overhead, the distant sound of a door closing. The upper servants were stirring. The butler would be down soon to unlock the silver pantry. The housekeeper would be down to check the stores. But for now it was still just her, the scullery maid, the lowest cog in the machine. She put the broom away. She looked at the vegetable basket. It was empty. She would have to go to the larder. She would have to fetch the potatoes. She would have to scrub them. The water would turn brown. Her hands would freeze. But before that, there was a moment, a pause between the lighting of the fire and the boiling of the water. She stood in the center of the scullery. She felt the cold radiating from the walls. She felt the dampness of the stone floor through her boots. She felt the weight of her wool dress. She closed her eyes for a second. She listened. She could hear the fire in the next room, a low roar, a crackle of coal. It was a good sound. It was the sound of success. She had brought the heat. She could hear the wind outside. It was picking up again with the dawn, a low moan around the eaves. And she could hear something else, or perhaps she just remembered it. The sound of the river, the crack of the ice. It was still there, waiting in the valley. The hole she had made would be frozen over by now, a new layer of skin on the wound. She would have to go back. She would have to break it again. The thought was not heavy. It was just a fact, like the stone, like the soot. She opened her eyes. She moved to the larder door. The day had begun. She opened the door. The smell of earth and root vegetables washed over her. She stepped into the dark. The sack of potatoes in the corner of the larder was a slumped, heavy mass, a burlap mountain that smelled of the cellar's deep, undisturbed dust. It was the winter store, the main carbohydrate engine of the house, dug from the autumn fields before the ground had hardened into the iron plate it was now. The maid gripped the corners of the sack. The fabric was rough, coarse enough to abrade the skin, and cold with a damp, pervasive chill that lived in the vegetable fibers. She pulled. The sack dragged across the stone floor with a dry, scratching sound, a friction of heavy weight against grit. Scritch, drag, scritch. It was a dead weight, resisting movement, settling back into inertia the moment she stopped pulling. She hauled it to the threshold of the scullery. The light here was the flat, diluted gray of a winter morning that had fully arrived but brought no brightness. The sun was a rumor behind the heavy banks of slate-colored clouds that pressed down on the roof of the house. Inside the scullery, the air was still a twilight of shadows and cold stone. She untied the string at the neck of the sack, her fingers picking at the stiff, knotted twine. It gave way. She rolled the burlap down. Inside, the potatoes were dark, crusted with dry soil, irregular lumps of earth that hid the food within. They looked like stones. They felt like stones, cold, hard, and unforgiving. She began the transfer. She scooped them up with her hands, filling a large wicker basket. The dirt from the skins coated her palms, turning the soot stains of the fire lighting into a muddy paste. The dust rose in the air, a fine, dry powder that caught in the throat. She filled the basket until it was heavy, then lifted it to the edge of the stone sink. The sink was empty now, the brass plug in place. She turned on the cold tap. The water that emerged was clearer than the dawn light, a cylinder of liquid ice. It splashed over the potatoes, darkening the dry soil instantly, turning the brown dust into black mud. The smell rose up, the raw mineral scent of wet earth, strong and primitive. It was the smell of the grave, of the field, of the dormant world sleeping under the frost. She picked up the scrubbing brush. The bristles were stiff, brown, and worn. She picked up the first potato. It was large, knobbly, deformed by its growth in the rocky soil. She held it under the stream of freezing water. She began to scrub. Scrub, scrub, scrub. The sound was wet and abrasive. The mud dissolved, washing away in dark rivulets that swirled around the drain. The water ran over her hands continuously. It was not just cold. It was a numbing agent, an anesthetic that stripped the sensation from her skin layer by layer. First the tingling, then the burning, then the dull ache, and finally the absence of feeling. Her fingers turned white, then a mottled blue-red. They moved stiffly, like mechanical claws, obeying the command of the brain but lacking the feedback of touch. She watched them work as if they belonged to someone else. The potato emerged from the mud. It was pale, yellowish-white skin pitted with dark eyes and scars. She dropped it into a basin of clean water. It sank with a plop, magnifying slightly in the liquid. She picked up the next one. The rhythm established itself. It was the rhythm of the scullery. Reach, scrub, rinse, drop, reach, scrub, rinse, drop. There were dozens of them, 100 perhaps. The house consumed potatoes with a voracious appetite. They were roasted for the family, boiled for the servants, mashed for the nursery. They were the base of the pyramid, and every single one had to pass through her freezing hands. She stood at the sink for an hour, maybe more. Time was not measured in minutes, but in the level of the basket. The pile of dirty potatoes went down. The pile of clean potatoes went up. The water in the sink became a thick, muddy soup. She had to drain it periodically, pulling the plug to let the silt wash away, then refilling it with fresh, biting cold water. The drain gurgled, a hollow, swallowing sound. Her feet, standing on the stone floor, were 2 blocks of pain. The cold from the flags seeped through the leather soles of her boots, through the wool stockings, and into the bone. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a slow, swaying motion that did little to help. The cold was patient. It waited in the stone. It waited in the water. It waited in the air. Behind her, through the open door, the kitchen had fully awakened. The sounds of industry were loud and layering over one another. The cook was chopping, a rapid staccato thud-thud-thud of a heavy knife on a wooden block. The kitchen maid was whisking, a high, rhythmic clink-clink-clink of metal against ceramic. The fire in the range was roaring now, the flue drawing hard, the iron expanding with ticks and pings. The smell of breakfast filled the air. Bacon frying, a salty, fatty, aggressive scent that made the salivary glands ache. Coffee brewing, a dark, bitter, rich aroma that spoke of alertness and warmth. Toast burning slightly, a dry carbon smell. These smells drifted into the scullery, taunting the cold air. They belonged to a world of warmth and consumption that the scullery maid facilitated but did not inhabit. She was the gatekeeper of the raw ingredients, the cleaner of the aftermath, but never the participant. Her breakfast had been the crust of dry bread and the memory of the weak tea. Her stomach was a hollow knot, tight and silent. She finished the scrubbing. The basket was empty. The basin was full of clean, wet potatoes. She wiped her hands on her apron. The canvas was damp and cold, offering no comfort. Her hands were raw, the skin puckered and white from the immersion. She flexed them, trying to force the blood back into the capillaries. They throbbed with a dull, distant pain. Now the peeling. She moved the basin to the wooden table. She took the small paring knife. She sat on the stool. This was a change of posture, but not a rest. The stool was hard. The air was colder down low, away from the steam of the sink. She picked up a potato. She set the blade. A swish. The peel came away in a long, curling ribbon. It was translucent, wet and dirty on one side, clean on the other. It fell onto the table, swish, another strip. She worked methodically, turning the potato in her left hand, guiding the knife with her right. The blade was sharp, worn thin by years of sharpening. It bit into the vegetable with a crisp sound. The pile of peelings grew, a wet, chaotic mound of brown and yellow skins. They smelled of raw starch and earth. The peeled potatoes were dropped into a second basin of water to keep them from turning brown. They gleamed in the water, ivory white, smooth and faceted by the knife. She fell into a trance. The repetition smoothed out the wrinkles of her mind. She did not think of the cold. She did not think of the hunger. She became the motion. The knife was an extension of her hand. The potato was the object. The peel was the waste. Swish, turn. The light in the room remained static. A flat, shadowless gray that revealed every crack in the plaster, every stain on the floor. It was a light without hope, without change. It was simply illumination, sufficient for work but insufficient for joy. The kitchen maid appeared in the doorway. She was carrying a tray of dirty cups. The early morning tea of the upper servants was finished. She set the tray down on the draining board with a rattle. She did not speak. She turned and left, rushing back to the warmth of the range. The scullery maid did not look up. She kept peeling. The cups would wait. The potatoes would not. When the last potato was peeled, she stood up. She gathered the peelings in her hands, wet, slimy, cold ribbons, and threw them into the slop bucket. She wiped the table down. She carried the basin of peeled potatoes into the kitchen. The heat of the kitchen hit her like a wall. It was humid, rich with smells, and loud. The cook was shouting an order to the kitchen maid. The kettle was whistling. The bacon was sizzling. The scullery maid placed the basin on the central table. No one looked at her. She was invisible, a ghost in gray wool. She turned and retreated, back through the green baize door, back to the silence. She returned to the scullery. The tray of cups was waiting. She washed them. Warm water this time from the small reserve in the kettle, a brief respite for her hands. She washed the saucers. She dried them. She stacked them. Then the bell rang, the front door, the post. Then the library bell. The master was up. The house was entering its high cycle. The butler appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, looking through to the scullery. He was a tall man, imposing in his black coat, his face a mask of professional indifference. "The front steps," he said. His voice was deep, smooth, and detached. "They are iced over, sand and scrub." He turned and vanished. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact that required a physical reaction. The scullery maid nodded to the empty doorway. She put down the drying cloth. She went to the cupboard. She took out a heavy wooden bucket. She filled it with hot water and soft soap. She took a bag of coarse sand. She took a stiff-bristled scrubbing brush. She carried the equipment through the kitchen, through the back passage, and out into the main hallway. The change in atmosphere was stark. The hallway was carpeted in plush red wool. The walls were paneled in dark, polished oak. The air smelled of beeswax and potpourri. It was silent here, but a hushed, expensive silence. She walked to the great front door. She unbolted it. She opened one heavy wing. The light flooded in, the same gray light, but here it fell on marble and mahogany. She stepped out onto the porch. The stone steps were broad, sweeping down to the gravel drive. They were coated in a sheet of verglas, clear ice formed by the freezing mist of the night. It was treacherous. A slip here would mean a broken bone for a gentleman or a lady. She knelt on the top step. The stone was granite, hard and freezing. She sprinkled the sand over the ice. Swish, scatter. The grains bounced and skittered. She dipped the brush in the hot, soapy water. She began to scrub. Scrub, grind, scrub, grind. The sand bit into the ice, breaking the glaze. The hot water melted the surface, creating a slush that she swept away with the brush. She worked her way down, step by step, kneeling, scrubbing, descending. The wind whipped around the columns of the porch. It blew her skirt around her legs. It blew the steam from the bucket into her face. It was exposed here. She was on display to the empty driveway, to the dormant garden, to the blind windows of the house. She scrubbed the granite until it was rough and safe. She washed the slush away. She dried the steps with a heavy cloth so they wouldn't freeze again immediately. When she reached the bottom, she stood up. She looked back up the steps. They were clean, dark gray stone, wet and gritty but safe. The path was cleared for those who would walk it. She picked up the bucket. It was cooling rapidly. She walked back up the steps, her boots leaving no mark on her work. She entered the house. She closed the heavy door, shutting out the wind. The silence of the hall returned. She walked back to the scullery. The journey from the front of the house to the back was a journey down the social ladder, from red carpet to flagstone, from beeswax to onions, from silence to the roar of the fire, from the clean to the dirty. She entered the scullery. She emptied the bucket. She rinsed the brush. She looked at the water tank, the boiler on the side of the range. She tapped the side of it with her knuckle. It rang hollow, clang, a high, empty sound. She looked at the kettle. It was steaming, but lighter than it had been. She looked at the buckets by the door. They were empty, dry metal. The realization settled on her like a familiar weight. The washing of the vegetables, the scrubbing of the floor, the cleaning of the steps, the morning tea, the boiling of the fish kettle. It had all consumed the supply. The house was thirsty. The tank needed to be filled. The cycle had completed its first revolution and was demanding the start of the second. She looked at the window. The light was static. It was late morning. The temperature had not risen. If anything, the sky looked heavier, darker, promising snow. She looked at her hands. They were red, raw, trembling slightly from the exertion of the scrubbing. The knuckles were swollen. The skin was dry and paper-thin. She looked at the shawl hanging on the peg. She looked at the heavy leather gloves. There was no decision to be made. There was only the necessity. She walked to the peg. She took down the shawl. She wrapped it around her shoulders, crossing it over her chest, tying it tight at the back. It was a hug of wool, a layer of armor against the air. She put on the gloves. The leather was stiff, cold from hanging in the draft. She picked up the buckets, 2 of them, galvanized iron, heavy wire handles. She picked up the ice breaker. The ash handle was smooth. The iron tip was dull. She walked to the back door. She unbolted it. The iron groaned. She opened the door. The wind was waiting. It rushed in, swirling the dust on the floor, fluttering the flame of the candle she had left burning. It smelled of the river. It smelled of the ice. She stepped out. The yard was frozen. The trees were black skeletons. The path led down. Down to the valley, down to the water. She began to walk. The buckets clanked against her legs, clink, clink. The boots crunched on the frozen ground, crunch, crunch. She left the house behind. She left the fire behind. She walked into the gray, freezing void of the landscape. She was going back to the source, back to the break in the ice. The path to the river was a familiar scar on the landscape, a rutted track of frozen mud and dead grass that wound its way down the slope of the hill like a dark vein in the white skin of the winter. The scullery maid walked it with the heavy, plodding gait of a draft animal, her body angled forward against the gradient and the wind. The empty buckets swung at her sides, light now, but heavy with the promise of the weight they would soon contain. Clink, clink. The metal rims brushed against her wool skirts, a small, rhythmic chime that was swallowed instantly by the vast, hollow silence of the valley. The light of the day had settled into a permanent, static gray. The sun, if it was there at all, was a diffused, invisible presence behind the ceiling of slate-colored clouds. There were no shadows now, only a flat, uniform illumination that drained the world of depth and color. The trees in the orchard were 2-dimensional shapes, intricate cutouts of black paper pasted against the sky. The stone wall was a strip of charcoal texture. The snow was a sheet of blank paper, waiting for a drawing that never came. She walked past the garden gate, the iron latch rattling softly in the breeze. She walked past the old elm tree, its bark fissured and gray, looking like the skin of an elephant. She kept her eyes on the ground, watching the placement of her boots. The path was treacherous. The ruts carved by the cart wheels in the autumn had frozen into sharp, jagged ridges of earth, hard as stone. Between them, pools of water had turned to patches of black ice, slick and deceiving. To slip here would be to fall onto iron-hard ground. To twist, an ankle would be a disaster that the house would not forgive. So she walked slowly, deliberately, 1 foot placed flat, weight shifted, 2nd foot brought forward. It was a meditation of movement, a focus so narrow it excluded the rest of the world. There was no horizon, no sky, no house. There was only the next 3 feet of frozen mud and the toe of her worn leather boot. The wind grew louder as she descended. On the hill it was a gusting force, pushing and pulling. Down here, funneling through the valley floor, it was a steady, streaming river of air. It flowed past her, parting around her body, seeking the warmth trapped in her clothes. It found the gap at her collar. It found the thinness of her shawl. It pressed the wool dress against her legs, outlining the form of the woman against the cold. It was a cleansing wind, scouring the world, stripping away the scent of the house, the coal smoke, the onions, the soap, and replacing it with the smell of pure, sterile cold. She reached the riverbank. The willows hung their branches down, curtaining the view. The tips of the branches were frozen into the ice, trapped by the rising and freezing of the water level. They looked like hair caught in a frozen pond. She pushed through them, the brittle twigs scratching against her sleeves. She stepped onto the jetty. The wooden planks were white with hoarfrost. A thick, furry layer of ice crystals that muffled the sound of her boots. The jetty felt precarious, a small finger of man-made wood extending out into the wild, indifferent expanse of the river. She set the buckets down. She looked at the hole she had made hours ago. It had changed. The black eye of the water had closed. A new skin of ice had formed over the wound, opaque and white at the edges, clear and dark in the center. It was thin, perhaps only an inch thick, a fragile lid over the depth. But it was a barrier. The river had tried to heal itself. The cold was relentless, constantly stitching the water back together, constantly trying to seal the surface. She unhooked the ice breaker from the post. The wood of the handle was freezing, sucking the heat from her leather gloves. She stepped to the edge of the planks. She raised the iron bar. This time there was no hesitation, no measuring of the distance. She knew the spot. She knew the weight. She let the tool fall. Crack. The sound was sharp, brittle, like the breaking of a window pane. The new ice shattered instantly, starring out in white lines. Fragments of the thin crust fell into the dark water below, bobbing and tilting before being swept under the lip of the older, thicker ice by the current. The water welled up, dark and oily, reclaiming the space. She struck again to widen the breach. Crack, splosh. The sound was wetter now. She chipped away the edges, creating a clean, round opening. The water swirled in the hole, agitated, black against the white surroundings. It looked thick like ink. It looked impossibly cold. She hung the tool back on the post. She picked up the first bucket. She knelt on the frosted wood. The cold from the planks came through her skirts immediately, a sharp, biting reminder of the temperature. She leaned over. She dipped the bucket. The water rushed in. Glug, glug, glug. It was the same sound as the morning, the same displacement of air, the same heavy accumulation of mass. The bucket dragged her arm down. She watched the water rise inside the metal cylinder. It was clear, but in the bucket it looked gray, taking on the color of the zinc lining. Tiny particles of ice floated in it, suspended like stars in a gray sky. She hauled it up. The weight was familiar. It was the weight of the day, the weight of the duty. She swung it onto the jetty. Water splashed over the rim, hitting her gloves, soaking into the leather. It burned. She filled the second bucket. The kneel, the dip, the rush, the pull, the lift. She stood up. Her knees cracked, a dry, popping sound in the silence. She looked at the two buckets. They were full. They were heavy. They were the fuel for the house. She looked out across the river. The far bank was a blur of gray mist. The trees on the other side were ghosts. The river stretched away to the left and to the right, a long, white road that no one walked. It was silent, absolutely, profoundly silent. The crack of the ice was gone. The splash of the water was gone. There was only the wind whispering in the dry reeds. She felt a moment of intense isolation. She was the only living thing in this frozen landscape. The birds were gone. The animals were hidden in their burrows. The fish were deep under the ice. There was only her, the gray figure on the wooden jetty, holding the iron buckets. But there was no fear in the isolation. There was only a kind of heavy peace, a recognition. She was part of this. She was as much a feature of the landscape as the willow tree or the stone. She was the force that moved the water. She gripped the handles. She lifted. The wire bit into her hands, compressing the leather gloves, pressing into the flesh. Her shoulders slumped under the load. Her spine adjusted, curving to take the strain. She turned and began the walk back. The return journey was always longer. The path was the same, but the gravity was different. The hill fought her. The mud fought her. The wind fought her. Every step was a negotiation with the physics of the earth. She walked with her eyes on the ground, watching the swing of the buckets. Step, swing, step, swing. She had to synchronize her legs with the pendulum motion of the water to avoid spilling. It was a rhythmic, rolling walk, a trance-like gait. She passed the willow trees. She passed the orchard wall. The stones of the wall were damp and dark, covered in patches of frozen moss that looked like black velvet. She could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the dry stone construction. Woo-woo-woo, a lonely, hollow sound. Her breath came in short, white puffs. She could feel her heart beating, a slow, heavy thudding in her chest. It was working hard, pumping the thick, cold blood through her veins. She felt the heat building inside her layers of wool, a damp, sweaty heat that clashed with the freezing air on her face. She reached the steep part of the path. She leaned forward, digging her toes into the frozen earth. The buckets pulled her backward. She gritted her teeth. She did not stop. To stop would be to break the rhythm. To stop would be to let the cold in. She had to keep moving. The momentum was everything. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted to 10. Then she started again. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a way to divide the infinity of the hill into manageable units. Just 10 steps, then another 10. She saw the house looming above her. It sat on the crest of the hill, a dark, sprawling shape against the gray sky. Smoke was rising from the chimneys, straight, gray columns that were whipped away by the wind at the top. The windows were dark eyes watching her approach. It looked impenetrable, a fortress of stone. She reached the garden gate. She maneuvered through, the buckets brushing the posts. She was in the yard now. The cobblestones were slippery. She shortened her stride, shuffling slightly. She reached the back door. She set the buckets down. Clink, clink. The sound was a release. Her hands remained curled in the shape of hooks for a moment, refusing to straighten. She flexed them painfully. She reached for the latch. She opened the door. The scullery was warm compared to the yard, but it was still a cold room. The air inside smelled of the day's labor, of damp stone, of potato skins, of soap, of coal dust. It was the smell of her life. She picked up the buckets. She carried them in. She kicked the door shut behind her. The wind was cut off. The silence of the house wrapped around her. She walked to the range, the boiler tank. She lifted the first bucket. She rested the rim. She poured. The water cascaded into the dark metal tank. Whoosh gurgle. It sounded like a waterfall in a cave. The water swirled in the tank, mixing with the heated water that remained, cooling it down, replenishing the volume. She poured the second bucket. The tank was full. The cycle was reset. The house had its water. She set the empty buckets down by the door. They sat there, two dark metal eyes waiting for the next trip. Tomorrow or the next hour. It didn't matter. They were always waiting. She walked to the center of the scullery. She stood there. Her arms hung at her sides, feeling longer than they had been in the morning, stretched by the weight. Her shoulders throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. Her feet were numb blocks inside her boots. She looked around the room. The sink was clean, the brass taps gleaming dully in the fading afternoon light. The draining board was bare, the wood scrubbed white. The floor was swept, the flagstones gray and uneven. The copper pans on the wall caught the faint light, glowing with a deep brownish-orange fire. It was a still life, a composition of textures and grays. It was a room designed for work, And now, for a brief moment, the work was paused. The kitchen door was open. The fire in the range was glowing red behind the bars. The cook was gone for the afternoon rest. The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Tock, tock, tock. Slow, deliberate, heavy. The scullery maid walked to the wooden stool in the corner. She sat down. She did not lean back. She sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, resting on the coarse canvas of her apron. She looked at her hands. They were red, raw, and chapped. The knuckles were swollen. The skin was stained with coal dust and earth. The nails were short and broken. They were the hands of the scullery. They were the hands that broke the ice. They were the hands that carried the river. She did not feel sadness. She did not feel anger. She felt a profound, heavy solidity. She was like the stone of the sink. She had endured the hot water. She had endured the cold ice. She had endured the abrasion of the sand and the caustic bite of the soda, and she was still here. She closed her eyes. In the darkness, she could hear the house breathing, the draft under the door, the settle of the timber, the tick of the clock. And beneath it all, she could still hear the river. She could see it in her mind, the gray water flowing under the white ice, the dark hole she had made already beginning to freeze over again, the ice crystals forming on the surface, knitting together, sealing the breach, the cold working tirelessly to undo her labor. And she knew that tomorrow she would go back. She would take the iron bar. She would break the ice. She would fill the buckets. It was a circle, a loop, a wheel that turned slowly, grinding the days into dust. She breathed in. The air tasted of coal and frost. She breathed out. The wind howled outside, a long, mournful note that wrapped around the house. It battered the window. It shook the door. But inside it was still. The scullery maid sat on her stool. The fire burned in the grate. The water waited in the tank. The ice waited on the river. She sat, she waited, she endured. The gray light faded into the charcoal of the evening. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the floor like dark fingers. The room slowly disappeared into the gloom. Eventually, there was only the outline of the woman, the faint gleam of the copper, and the sound of the wind. And the silence, the heavy, cold, eternal silence.